Most people think they know what getting high means in the modern world. But what if I told you that centuries before anyone had ever heard of recreational drugs, people in medieval times were already exploring altered states of consciousness in ways that would shock you today? They weren't just drinking ale and praying. They were experimenting with plants, ointments, and substances that could transport them to entirely different realities. Some did it for medicine, others for spiritual visions, and many just stumbled into it by accident. The line between healing and hallucinating was razor thin, and the results were often more bizarre than anything you could imagine. We'll explore this hidden world of medieval intoxication in this video and learn how our ancestors were getting high long before we thought they were. If you like these videos, I would appreciate if you clicked like or subscribed, as it's important for the channel and it helps others find it too, just like you did. Thank you. Now, let's get started. Picture yourself wandering through a medieval garden on a misty morning, where ordinary-looking plants held extraordinary secrets. The Middle Ages weren't just about mud and monks, though there were plenty of both. Hidden beneath all that coarse wool and daily struggle, people discovered ways to escape their harsh reality. Even if just for a few hours, every village had someone who knew which flowers could blur your vision, which roots might bring prophetic dreams, and which seeds could transport you somewhere far from the endless cycle of feudal obligations. These weren't your modern recreational substances, mind you, they were woven into the very fabric of medieval life. Disguised as medicine, spiritual practice, or sometimes just unfortunate accidents with moldy bread, the concept of altering one's consciousness wasn't foreign or forbidden, it was simply part of existence. When your daily entertainment consisted of watching a knight struggle through reading lessons, or wondering if your neighbor would survive another bout of mysterious dancing sickness, well, a mind-expanding mushroom didn't sound quite so unreasonable. Doctors prescribed these herbs with scholarly confidence. Monks cultivated them in monastery gardens with divine purpose. And those mysterious figures on the village outskirts, the ones people whispered about, they knew exactly how to prepare ointments that supposedly made people believe they were soaring naked through moonlit skies, accompanied by rather unsavory celestial companions. The medieval pharmacy was surprisingly diverse. There were roots that supposedly screamed when pulled from the earth, though that might have been the harvester's imagination. Seeds promised visions of the future, assuming you survived the experience. And certain flower preparations could make the most devout believer question whether they were still earthbound or had somehow ascended to commune with higher powers. Pain relief came in many forms back then, and not all of it was purely physical. When your existence revolved around back-breaking labor, unpredictable harvests, and the constant threat of disease, anything that could provide mental escape became precious. Some sought divine inspiration through carefully prepared concoctions, while others simply wanted their aching joints to feel better for a few blessed hours. The social hierarchy determined how these substances reached different people. If you were fortunate enough to have status, perhaps a learned physician might prescribe something exotic and expensive. Common folk relied on local wisdom, passed down through generations of trial and error, often delivered by that peculiar character every village seemed to have, the one who claimed to have learned ancient secrets from woodland creatures. Gardens weren't just for growing food, they were treasure troves of possibility. With nothing more than a mortar, pestle, and rather casual attitude toward proper dosages, medieval people crafted their own chemical adventures. The line between medicine and mind alteration was beautifully blurred, creating a world where healing and transcendence often arrived in the same earthenware cup. These weren't back-alley dealings or exclusive gatherings. This was everyday medieval life, where the extraordinary grew alongside the ordinary, and where people understood that sometimes escaping reality was just another form of survival. Back in medieval Europe, the countryside was practically a natural pharmacy, sprawling with plants that held secrets both wonderful and terrifying. Every forest, every meadow, every forgotten corner of land was filled with roots and leaves that could change your entire reality with just a pinch or a brew. Picture this world where the boundary between healing and hallucinating was about as clear as morning fog. Nature held all the cards, and she played them with a mischievous smile. The people who worked with these plants, well, they came from all walks of life. Physicians with their formal training, monks tending their monastery gardens, midwives who knew the old ways, and those mysterious wandering herbalists who showed up in villages with bags full of mysterious remedies. These practitioners, they all shared one thing in common. They understood that the same plant that could ease your suffering today might send you on a journey to meet angels tomorrow. The medieval world was filled with botanical adventures whether you signed up for them or not. Consider the curious case of henbane, a plant that embodied nature's sense of dark humor. In the right hands, with the right preparation, it was a gentle friend, bringing sleep to the restless and peace to those in pain. But henbane was moody, unpredictable. Prepare it wrong, measure it poorly, and suddenly you'd find yourself convinced that removing your shoes was absolutely urgent, right before you took off running through the forest, screaming at invisible companions. This wasn't unusual behavior for medieval herbs. They demanded respect, knowledge, and just a little bit of luck. Then there was mandrake, perhaps the most theatrical of all medieval plants. Its root twisted and curved in ways that reminded people of tiny human figures, complete with arms and legs. The legends around mandrake were as twisted as its roots. People believed that when you pulled it from the earth, it would let out a shriek so horrible, so piercing, that anyone who heard it would drop dead instantly. This didn't stop people from wanting it, of course. Medieval folks were nothing if not resourceful. They developed elaborate harvesting techniques, usually involving rope, a very unfortunate dog, and a considerable distance between themselves and the screaming root. Once safely obtained, mandrake promised incredible things. Unconsciousness when you needed escape, visions that might reveal hidden truths, and if the stars aligned just right, dreams that could show you the future. But mandrake was also a gambler's choice. Some days it delivered magical experiences. Other days, well, those people no longer had need for any herbs at all. Belladonna earned its reputation through its very name, deadly nightshade. The medieval world had a peculiar relationship with danger, and belladonna perfectly embodied this contradiction. Women would use it to make their eyes sparkle, dilating their pupils for beauty. The same plant that enhanced their appearance could also steal their pain, transport them to other realms, or end their story entirely. Medieval self-care required a level of courage that modern spa treatments simply can't match. These powerful plants rarely worked alone. Medieval practitioners were like botanical composers, mixing herbs into complex symphonies of effect. They created teas that could carry you gently into sleep, tinctures that promised visions of divine truth, and oils that seemed to make the boundary between earth and sky dissolve entirely. Some of their most famous creations were those legendary flying ointments, mysterious concoctions that promised to lift both body and spirit into impossible journeys. The interesting thing about medieval plant medicine is that consent wasn't always part of the equation. Sometimes these powerful botanical cocktails appeared in religious ceremonies, where the line between spiritual experience and chemical alteration blurred into something altogether mysterious. Medical procedures often involved herbs that changed more than just physical pain, transforming the entire experience into something dreamlike and strange. And then there were the well-meaning apothecaries, those neighborhood experts who mixed their remedies with genuine care and occasionally questionable judgment. They operated in a world where the difference between medicine and magic was largely a matter of perspective, and where every herb held the potential for miracles, disasters, or something wonderfully in between. Picture this: a world where your local pain relief came from a plant that might either cure your headache or convince you that your dinner was talking back to you. Welcome to medieval medicine, where every remedy was basically a gamble with your sanity. There was this plant, growing wild across Europe for centuries, that everyone knew about, but nobody really trusted. Botanists called it Hyoscyamus niger, but most folks just knew it as henbane, the thing that turned poor Uncle Bernard into a quacking mess last winter. Medieval society had this unofficial pharmacy system, you see. No prescriptions, no safety warnings, just plants and prayers. Henbane sat right at the center of this chaotic world of herbal healing, like a botanical wildcard that could go either way. The monks, bless their scholarly hearts, wrote everything down in their herbals. Page after page documenting which plants did what, or at least what they thought they did. These weren't just random notes either. These were serious medical texts, passed down through monastery libraries like ancient medical journals. Physicians of the time, they loved henbane for its ability to dull pain. Imagine having a toothache in an era before Novocaine, before aspirin, before anything really. A small dose of henbane could turn agony into something bearable. Childbirth, surgery, broken bones, all made slightly less horrific with this mysterious plant. But here's where things get interesting. The same plant that could ease your suffering could also launch you into another dimension entirely. The difference between medicine and madness came down to dosage, timing, and honestly, a fair bit of luck. See, henbane contains these compounds, scopolamine and hyoscyamine, that mess with your brain's neurotransmitters. Your medieval ancestors didn't know about neurotransmitters, of course. They just knew that sometimes the plant helped, and sometimes it sent you on a journey to meet relatives who'd been dead for decades. The symptoms, when things went sideways, were quite the spectacle. Visual distortions that made the world shimmer and bend. Disorientation so complete that familiar rooms became alien landscapes. Your mouth would go dry as parchment. Thirst would consume you, and suddenly you'd find yourself having deep philosophical discussions with vegetables. People consumed henbane in all sorts of creative ways. Some smoked it, watching the strange smoke curl upward as their consciousness prepared for takeoff. Others brewed it into teas, sipping carefully, hoping they'd measured correctly. The most adventurous mixed it with animal fat and rubbed it directly onto their skin, a method favored by those who preferred their altered states, absorbed slowly, steadily. This skin application method was particularly popular among certain groups, people who wanted their consciousness rearranged in ways that linear thinking simply couldn't accommodate. Mystics, healers, and yes, those we called witches, all knew about this topical technique. The church, predictably, wasn't thrilled about any of this. Religious authorities believed visions should come from saints, not shrubs. Divine revelation was supposed to arrive through prayer and devotion, not through rubbing questionable plant mixtures on your skin. Anything that altered perception was automatically suspicious, potentially heretical. Yet henbane persisted, because pain persisted, and people needed relief. Controlled substances didn't exist as a concept yet. There were no drug schedules, no pharmaceutical regulations, just community knowledge passed down through generations of trial error and occasional conversations with turnips. Healers swore by it, despite the risks. Mystics incorporated it into their practices, seeking altered states for spiritual purposes. People with nothing left to lose, facing unbearable pain or desperate circumstances, turned to henbane as their last hope. The plant even found its way into beer recipes, believe it or not. Medieval brewers experimented with all sorts of additives before settling on hops. Imagine stumbling home from the tavern, not just drunk, but potentially hallucinating, wondering why the village fountain was speaking Latin. Eventually, authorities banned henbane from beer production, recognizing that combining alcohol with powerful psychoactive compounds created more chaos than anyone could manage. Hops became the standard, safer, more predictable, less likely to convince drinkers they could communicate with livestock. This shift represents something larger about medieval society's relationship with dangerous plants. There was this constant tension between desperate need for medical relief and the unpredictable nature of plant medicines. Every remedy carried risks. Every dose was an experiment. Think about the courage, or perhaps desperation, required to use something like henbane. You're suffering, maybe from chronic pain, maybe from illness, and someone offers you this plant that might help, might hurt, might transport you to another realm entirely. The decision says something profound about human nature, about our willingness to risk sanity for the chance at relief. Medieval people lived with uncertainty in ways we can barely imagine. Their medicine cabinet was essentially a collection of plants with varying degrees of danger attached. Henbane represented both the promise and peril of this approach. A single species that could heal or harm, depending on factors often beyond anyone's control. The medieval world held many mysteries, but few plants stirred up as much fascination and terror as a peculiar root that grew in Mediterranean soils. This wasn't just any ordinary plant. When you pulled it from the earth, its thick, gnarled root looked disturbingly like a tiny human being, complete with what seemed like arms, legs, and a torso. People called it mandrake, and they believed it possessed powers that could blur the line between healing and magic, between dreams and nightmares. The root's scientific name was Mandragora officinarum, but most folks didn't care about botanical classifications. They cared about what this strange plant could do to your mind, your body, and possibly your soul. Medieval herbalists swore that mandrake could solve almost any problem. Trouble sleeping? Mandrake tea might help. Facing a painful surgery with nothing but prayers and hope? A bit of mandrake could numb the agony. Looking to spark romance or boost fertility? Well, carrying a dried mandrake root was supposedly the answer, though one has to wonder about the romantic appeal of a shriveled, human-shaped plant tucked in your pocket. The most fascinating and frankly terrifying belief about mandrake involved the harvest itself. According to medieval wisdom, the moment you tried to uproot this plant, it would release a blood-curdling scream. Not a gentle rustle or a soft whisper, but a shriek so piercing, so unnaturally human, that it could literally kill anyone who heard it. This presented an obvious problem. How do you harvest a plant that might murder you with sound? Medieval ingenuity came up with a solution that reveals both human cleverness and a rather callous attitude toward animals. The standard technique involved tying one end of a rope to the mandrake root and the other end to a dog. Then you'd walk away, far enough to avoid the deadly scream, and somehow convince the dog to pull the plant free. The assumption was simple, if morally questionable. Better the dog should die from the mandrake's shriek than the human who needed the plant. Once the unfortunate canine had done its job, and presumably paid the ultimate price, you could safely collect your prize. Even by medieval standards, this approach raised some uncomfortable ethical questions about the value of animal life versus human convenience. But assuming you survived the harvest, or rather, assuming your dog didn't, the mandrake offered impressive versatility. You could dry it and grind it into powder. You could steep it in wine to create a potent drink. You could even wear pieces of it as protective charms, though walking around with bits of screaming root probably sent mixed social signals. Medieval medicine relied heavily on mandrake's sedative properties. Before the days of modern anesthesia, surgeons needed something to dull their patient's pain, and mandrake delivered. A carefully measured dose could render someone unconscious, or at least too drowsy to fully appreciate having their appendages sawed off with primitive tools. The plant also gained a reputation for inducing vivid, prophetic dreams. People believed that mandrake could open doorways in the mind, allowing glimpses of future events or hidden truths. Whether these visions contained actual prophecy or just reflected the hallucinations of a drugged brain remained open to interpretation. Naturally, the medieval church viewed mandrake with deep suspicion. Any substance that caused visions, especially visions that didn't come through official religious channels, fell into the dangerous category of witchcraft. Church authorities worried that people might mistake drug-induced hallucinations for divine revelations, which could undermine religious authority. Yet even monks, though supposedly pure servants of God, couldn't entirely resist mandrake's practical applications. Medieval monastery libraries contained detailed herbals, botanical guides that carefully recorded mandrake recipes, alongside instructions for growing holy vegetables. These religious scholars wrote down precise measurements, preparation techniques, and usage guidelines with suspicious thoroughness, for people who supposedly disapproved of the plant. The contradiction reveals something deeply human about medieval attitudes toward forbidden knowledge. Official doctrine might condemn mandrake as potentially evil, but when faced with genuine medical needs, practical concerns often won out over theological purity. Used correctly, mandrake could genuinely improve medieval life. It offered real pain relief in an age when medical options were brutally limited. It provided sleep for chronic insomniacs. It even delivered recreational experiences for those brave enough to risk the side effects. But used incorrectly, mandrake became a pathway to misery. Too much could trigger violent vomiting, dangerous delirium, or worse. The line between helpful dose and toxic overdose remained frustratingly thin, especially in an era when precise measurements were more art than science. This tension between benefit and danger perfectly captured the medieval relationship with nature itself. The natural world offered incredible gifts, powerful tools for healing and transformation, but it demanded respect, knowledge, and more than a little courage. Mandrake embodied this duality, a plant that could either save your life or end it, depending on your wisdom, your dosage, and perhaps your luck. Picture this, if you will. A medieval feast is in full swing, candles flickering across stone walls, and a noblewoman sits at the high table. Her eyes are unusually large, pupils dark and wide, drawing stares from across the room. She's achieved the perfect mysterious gaze that everyone admires. But there's a secret behind those captivating eyes, and it's slowly poisoning her. This is the world of belladonna, a plant whose very name whispers of beauty and danger. Beautiful lady, that's what belladonna means, and for good reason. Medieval women discovered that a few drops of this plant's extract could transform their appearance entirely. Those dilated pupils weren't just striking, they were considered almost saintly, mysterious in a way that made people lean in closer. Of course, beauty has always demanded sacrifice. The same drops that created those mesmerizing eyes also brought blurry vision, making it nearly impossible to see clearly. Sunlight became an enemy, too bright and harsh to bear. And sometimes, just sometimes, the mind would wander into strange territories, hearing whispers that weren't there. But belladonna wasn't content to be merely a cosmetic curiosity. This plant, also known by its more honest name, deadly nightshade, had developed quite a reputation in medieval medicine. Physicians reached for it when patients writhed in pain, when sleep refused to come, or when they needed someone to speak truths they'd rather keep hidden. Though the truths that emerged were often more like fevered dreams than coherent confessions, the plant's power came from two particular compounds that danced with the human nervous system in fascinating ways. Atropine and scopolamine, chemicals that could nudge the mind from mild confusion all the way to full-blown hallucinations. Imagine walls that seemed to breathe, or ceiling beams that appeared to drip mysterious substances. Medieval healers knew they were working with something dangerous, yet irresistible. When a surgeon needed to saw through bone, belladonna could numb the screaming. When someone required a sleep so deep it resembled death itself, perhaps for reasons we'd rather not examine too closely, belladonna delivered. And for those seeking visions of saints, or perhaps less heavenly visitors, well, the plant rarely disappointed. This wasn't some underground secret, either. Belladonna appeared openly in medical texts, recipe books, and even love charms throughout medieval Europe. Herbalists cultivated it carefully, physicians prescribed it regularly, and common folk whispered about its more mysterious applications. It found its way into flying ointments, those strange concoctions that supposedly helped people soar through the night sky, at least in their minds. The relationship between medieval people and this deadly plant reveals something profound about human nature. We've always been drawn to things that blur the line between healing and harm, between beauty and danger. Belladonna embodied this contradiction perfectly, offering gifts that came wrapped in very serious risks. Medical knowledge back then operated on different principles than today. end a protest and different principles than today. When plague swept through towns like wildfire, when basic hygiene remained a mystery, when pain relief meant choosing between agony and potential poison, physicians made calculations we might find shocking. The line between medicine and magic blurred constantly, and plants like belladonna lived comfortably. In that grey area, women weren't the only ones fascinated by belladonna's transformative powers. The plant appeared in all sorts of contexts, from monastery gardens, where monks grew it for their infirmaries, to marketplace stalls where herbalists sold carefully measured doses. Everyone seemed to understand that this particular plant demanded respect, even as they continued using it for purposes both practical and peculiar. The medieval world was full of such contradictions, places where beauty and poison intermingled, where medicine and magic shared the same shelf. Belladonna simply happened to be one of the most dramatic examples, a plant that promised transformation while delivering consequences that could range from mildly uncomfortable to permanently final. Picture a world where people sought altered states of consciousness centuries before modern substances existed. Medieval times weren't just about knights and castles, they were filled with folks experimenting with mysterious concoctions that would make today's chemists raise an eyebrow. These weren't your typical herbal remedies either. We're talking about sophisticated delivery methods that medieval people developed through trial, error, and probably a lot of very strange nights. They understood something important. The skin could absorb things, transport them through the body, create experiences that defied explanation. The ingredients alone read like a horror movie shopping list. Belladonna, with its beautiful but deadly berries. Hemlock, famous for taking down Socrates himself. Fat from black cats, because apparently regular animal fat wasn't mysterious enough. And the preparation rituals, stirring counterclockwise under moonlight, as if the universe itself needed to bless these bizarre recipes. Medieval apothecaries weren't playing around when they crafted their ointments and balms. These thick, greasy pastes contained plant extracts so potent they could send someone into hours of vivid hallucinations. The consistency of thick honey, the smell of herbs and mystery, the promise of experiences beyond ordinary life. But here's where things get really interesting. Application wasn't simply rubbing these concoctions on your arm like modern lotions. Medieval people discovered that certain areas of the body absorbed substances much more effectively. Mucous membranes, those sensitive tissues in intimate places, became the preferred method for maximum absorption. Enter the legendary flying ointments, those infamous mixtures associated with witchcraft and supernatural experiences. Henbane provided the drowsiness, mandrake added the hallucinations, belladonna brought the euphoria, and pig fat held everything together in one slippery, potent blend. Women would apply these ointments to broomsticks, then straddle them during application, leading to centuries of flying witch imagery. The sensation wasn't actually flight, of course, but the powerful psychoactive compounds created such vivid experiences that users genuinely believed they had soared through night skies, visited distant lands, communed with otherworldly beings. The results varied wildly from person to person. Some users reported beautiful, transcendent journeys through celestial realms. Others woke up miles from home, covered in mud, with no memory of their nocturnal adventures. A few unfortunate souls found themselves convinced they had transformed into animals, spending days on all fours, refusing human food. Medieval potions took a different approach entirely. Instead of topical application, these liquid concoctions were designed for consumption. Wine served as the perfect vehicle, masking bitter herbal flavors while helping the stomach absorb active compounds more efficiently. Poppy extract mixed with spiced wine created a powerful painkiller, strong enough to allow primitive surgeries without modern anesthesia. Patients would drink these potions, then drift into deep, dream-filled states where pain became distant, reality became flexible, consciousness became something entirely different than normal waking life. Traveling apothecaries, those wandering merchants of altered states, carried bottles and vials filled with mysterious liquids. They promised cures for heartbreak, solutions for sleeplessness, remedies for spiritual emptiness. Their recipes often contained ingredients so caustic they could literally dissolve leather. Yet people lined up to purchase these dubious elixirs. These wandering medicine men understood something profound about human nature. People have always sought escape from ordinary consciousness, relief from physical pain, glimpses of experiences beyond the mundane world. Whether through religious ecstasy, herbal concoctions, or elaborate rituals, humans consistently pursue altered states of awareness. The unpredictability made everything more intense. Unlike modern substances with standardized dosages, medieval preparations varied wildly in potency. The same recipe might produce gentle relaxation one day, complete ego dissolution the next. Users never knew whether they would spend the evening in peaceful contemplation, wild hallucinations, or terrifying encounters with imaginary creatures. Some experienced divine visions, conversations with angels, glimpses of heavenly realms that inspired lifelong spiritual devotion. Others found themselves locked in battle with demons, convinced evil forces had invaded their souls, swearing off these substances forever while trembling in monastery corners. The social context surrounding these experiences created entire subcultures. Secret societies formed around sharing recipes, comparing experiences, developing safer application methods. Knowledge passed from generation to whispered conversations, hidden manuscripts, coded symbols that only initiates could interpret. Medieval people weren't primitive or naive about these powerful substances. They developed sophisticated understanding of dosage, timing, set, and setting long before modern researchers coined those terms. They knew certain preparations worked better during specific moon phases, particular seasons, carefully chosen locations, away from prying eyes. The line between medicine, spirituality, and recreation blurred completely. The same ointment used to treat arthritis might also provide mystical visions. The same tincture prescribed for melancholy could transport someone to alternate dimensions. Healing and transcendence intertwined in ways that modern compartmentalized thinking struggles to comprehend. Perhaps most fascinating is how these medieval experiments with consciousness shaped cultural narratives that persist today. Flying witches, magical transformations, supernatural journeys, all rooted in very real experiences with very real alterations in human perception and awareness. Picture this: a woman in medieval times, clutching what looks like an ordinary household cleaning tool. But this broomstick, this simple bundle of twigs tied to a wooden handle, carries secrets that would make your grandmother blush. The story begins not with magic, but with chemistry. Though the people of those times didn't know they were conducting experiments, they certainly were. Deep in forests and hidden gardens, certain plants grew wild. Henbane, with its pale yellow flowers and black centers; belladonna, beautiful and deadly, earning its name as the Beautiful Lady; and datura, trumpet-shaped blooms that promised visions, or death, depending on the dose. These weren't your typical garden variety herbs, each one packed with compounds that could scramble a human mind, like eggs in a hot pan. The women who knew about these plants, often the village healers, the midwives, the ones who understood nature's pharmacy, they discovered something remarkable. These plants could transport you without ever leaving your room. But here's where the story takes an interesting turn. Eating these plants, that was a one-way ticket to an early grave. The stomach, you see, absorbs things far too efficiently. What might give you visions could just as easily give you a funeral. So these clever women, these early chemists in disguise, they found another way. The human body, it turns out, has multiple entry points for substances. Some areas absorb things more readily than others. Delicate tissues, thin membranes, places where the barrier between inside and outside grows gossamer thin. This knowledge, passed down through whispered conversations and careful demonstrations, became the foundation of something extraordinary. Enter the broomstick, not as a flying machine, but as an applicator. A delivery system, if you will. The wooden handle, smooth and purposeful, would be coated with thick salves made from those dangerous plants. Mixed with animal fat, Ground into paste, these ointments held the key to otherworldly experiences. The application process required privacy, discretion, and a certain amount of anatomical knowledge. Within minutes of proper application, reality would begin to shift. The walls of the cottage might seem to dissolve. The sensation of lifting, floating, soaring through moonlit skies would wash over the user like warm honey. Imagine experiencing flight centuries before humans actually achieved it. The rush of wind that existed only in the mind. The view of your village from impossible heights. The sensation of traveling vast distances in moments. Visiting strange gatherings, meeting mysterious figures in shadowy realms. These journeys felt absolutely real to those who took them. The brain, flooded with plant alkaloids, created experiences so vivid, so detailed, that distinguishing them from reality became impossible. Women reported attending elaborate feasts in dark forests, dancing with creatures that defied description, flying to distant mountains for secret meetings. Of course, their bodies never left the ground, never left the room, most likely. But their minds traveled to places that mapmakers could never chart. The chemical compounds from those plants rewrote the rules of perception, creating internal worlds as vast and detailed as the external one. The timing of these experiences often aligned with practical needs. A difficult birth requiring supernatural assistance, a sick child needing otherworldly intervention, a community crisis demanding wisdom from beyond the veil. The ointments offered access to knowledge and power that ordinary consciousness couldn't provide. But authorities, those who watched and judged from positions of power, they saw something entirely different. Where users experienced transcendence, officials saw evidence of devil worship. Where chemistry created visions, they identified supernatural transportation. The gap between scientific reality and religious interpretation grew wider with each documented case. Inquisitors armed with quills and suspicion recorded these accounts with meticulous detail, not because they understood the pharmacology involved, but because they needed evidence for their cases. Flying, in their worldview, required demonic assistance. No mortal human could achieve such feats without selling their soul. The irony runs deep here. These experiences, so deeply personal and internally generated, became proof of external evil alliances. The very unreliability of drug-induced hallucinations, their inconsistency and impossible elements, somehow served as evidence of their supernatural origin. Medieval justice operated on different principles than modern law. Evidence worked differently. Witness testimony carried weight, even when that witness had consumed mind-altering substances. Confessions extracted under various pressures held validity, regardless of the confessor's mental state. So the humble broomstick, that domestic tool found in every household, became associated with the darkest of crimes. Its practical application in these chemical journeys transformed it into a symbol of otherworldly power and demonic alliance. The transformation from cleaning implement to witch's mount happened not through magic, but through misunderstanding. This disconnect between reality and perception, between chemistry and spirituality, between experience and interpretation, it captures something fundamental about human nature. We create meaning from mystery. We build explanations from incomplete information. We transform the unknown into the feared, the misunderstood, into the forbidden. The women who used these ointments, they were explorers of consciousness, centuries before such exploration had a name. They were chemists before chemistry existed as a formal discipline. They were navigators of inner space during an era obsessed with mapping outer territories. Long before anyone understood the intricate chemistry of the human mind, people discovered that certain plants could unlock doors to experiences beyond the ordinary. While much of medieval Europe remained entangled in superstition and fear, treating plants as either magical cure-alls or demonic influences, a different story was unfolding across the Islamic world. In the bustling markets of Cairo, the scholarly halls of Baghdad, and the mystical gatherings of Persian cities, hashish had become something far more nuanced than Europe's crude experiments with herbs and potions. This concentrated essence of cannabis, extracted and refined from the plant's resin, represented a sophisticated understanding of how nature's chemistry could interact with human consciousness. The preparation itself was an art form, rather than the bitter, unpalatable concoctions that characterized European medicine. Hashish was carefully blended with honey, aromatic spices, and complementary herbs. These early edibles weren't just more pleasant to consume. They represented a culinary tradition that understood how different ingredients could work together to create specific effects. What's fascinating is how methodically Islamic scholars approached this plant. They weren't simply experimenting blindly or relying on folklore passed down through generations. Physicians documented dosages, effects, and reactions with the same careful attention they applied to other medical treatments. This wasn't superstition, it was early pharmacology in action. The spiritual dimension adds another layer to this story. Within Sufism, Islam's mystical branch, hashish became intertwined with the pursuit of divine connection. Sufi practitioners believed that ordinary consciousness, with all its daily concerns and ego-driven thoughts, created barriers between the individual and spiritual truth. Hashish, they discovered, could temporarily dissolve these mental boundaries. Picture these gatherings, dimly lit rooms where mystics would consume carefully prepared hashish, then spend hours in contemplation, prayer, or philosophical discussion. They weren't seeking escapism, but rather a deeper engagement with questions about existence, divinity, and the nature of reality itself. The plant became a tool for introspection, helping practitioners examine their thoughts and beliefs from new perspectives. The poetry and literature from this period reflects this complex relationship with hashish. Writers described their experiences with the same intensity and metaphorical richness that artists have always brought to transformative experiences. Their words captured both the profound insights and the simple, almost childlike wonder that the substance could produce. But this wasn't a universally accepted practice. Islamic rulers frequently found themselves torn between tolerance and prohibition. Some worried that widespread hashish use would lead to social problems, decreased productivity, or inappropriate behavior during religious observances. The image of people struggling to maintain composure during prayer, overcome by fits of laughter or deep contemplation, created ongoing tensions between spiritual seekers and religious authorities. These periodic attempts at prohibition reveal something universal about human nature and governance. Throughout history, when authorities try to completely eliminate something that people find meaningful or enjoyable, the results are predictably mixed. Hashish use continued, despite official disapproval, often moving to more discreet settings or being practiced with greater secrecy. The legendary assassins, those mysterious figures from medieval Islamic history, became forever linked with hashish in popular imagination. Stories claimed they consumed the substance before undertaking their deadly missions, using it to achieve the right mental state for their dangerous work. While historians now consider these accounts largely mythical, they demonstrate how cannabis products were already surrounded by an aura of mystery and conflicting narratives. What emerges from this period is a picture of sophisticated drug culture, one that understood both the potential benefits and risks of altering consciousness through plant medicines. Islamic scholars weren't naive about hashish effects. They recognized that it could enhance certain experiences while potentially interfering with others. This knowledge existed alongside a broader understanding of pharmacology that wouldn't reach Europe for several more centuries. While European medicine remained largely theoretical, based on ancient texts and untested assumptions, Islamic physicians were conducting what amounted to clinical observations, noting how different people responded to various substances under different circumstances. The contrast with European approaches to cannabis and other psychoactive plants couldn't be more stark. Where Islamic culture developed nuanced, documented practices around hashish use, European experiments remained crude, dangerous, and largely ineffective. This difference reflected broader patterns in how these civilizations approached learning, medicine, and the relationship between spiritual practice and altered states of consciousness. The legacy of this Islamic relationship with hashish extends far beyond the medieval period, establishing patterns of use, preparation, and cultural integration that would influence later developments across many different societies and time periods. There was once a time when walking into a place of worship meant stepping into something that felt almost magical. The air would be thick with clouds of sweet, heavy smoke, drifting lazily through shafts of colored light. This wasn't just atmosphere, though most people didn't know it at the time. Medieval churches had a particular smell, and it wasn't always pleasant. Imagine hundreds of people gathered together, most of whom bathed maybe once a month if they were lucky. Add to that the lingering odors of fish stew, unwashed wool clothing, and whatever else people carried in from the muddy streets outside. It was, quite frankly, a fragrant disaster. But the church had a solution. They burned resins, precious substances that came from faraway lands. Two of the most prized were frankincense and myrrh, the same gifts that the wise men supposedly brought to baby Jesus. These resins traveled incredible distances from the Arabian Peninsula and the Horn of Africa, carried by traders across deserts and seas. The church fathers had their official reasons for burning these expensive imports. They said the smoke carried prayers up to heaven, that it cleansed the air of evil spirits, that it made the space more holy, and perhaps it did all of these things, in a way. But it also did something else entirely, something that wouldn't be understood for centuries. When frankincense burns, it releases chemical compounds that can actually affect your brain. Modern scientists have discovered that one of these compounds, called incensol acetate, has the power to influence your limbic system. That's the part of your brain that controls emotions and feelings. In simpler terms, breathing in frankincense smoke can make you feel calm, dreamy, even a little disconnected from reality. Now picture this. You're a medieval peasant, and you've been fasting for days as part of your religious preparation. You're probably a bit dehydrated, definitely hungry, and you've just walked several miles to get to church. You squeeze into a small stone building with hundreds of other people. There are no windows to speak of, certainly no ventilation system. The air is thick and still. Then the service begins. Hour after hour passes. The chanting continues. The incense keeps burning, and that sweet smoke just hangs in the air, with nowhere to go. You breathe it in with every breath, and slowly, something starts to happen. The edges of reality begin to soften just a little bit. The world feels more dreamlike, more mysterious. It's no wonder that monks and devoted churchgoers often reported having visions during these long services. They would see angels, hear divine voices, feel touched by something beyond this world. The church celebrated these experiences as proof of God's presence, and maybe they were, in their own way, but they might also have been the result of mild intoxication from resin fumes. This wasn't just happening in Christian churches either. Walk into a mosque, a synagogue, a Buddhist temple, even the sacred groves where pagans still gathered in secret, and you'd find the same thing. Incense, smoke, that same otherworldly atmosphere. It seems that humans, regardless of what gods they worship, have always understood that there's something powerful about breathing in sacred smoke. The religious leaders of every faith had their explanations for why incense was important. It purified the space. It honored the divine. It helped lift the human soul closer to heaven. These weren't wrong, exactly, but there was also a very practical side to it all. Those long religious services, sometimes lasting 5 or 6 hours, would have been nearly unbearable without a little chemical assistance. Think of it as humanity's first mood enhancement technology. Long before anyone understood brain chemistry or psychoactive compounds, people had figured out that certain burning plants and resins could change how you feel. They could make tedious rituals more bearable, turn ordinary moments into something that felt transcendent. The irony is delicious, really. The same religious authorities who might condemn other forms of intoxication were unknowingly providing their congregations with a mild psychoactive experience every single week. They called it worship, and perhaps that's exactly what it was, just with a little chemical enhancement that nobody quite understood. Even today, when you walk into an old cathedral or temple where incense is still burned regularly, you can feel it. That particular combination of mystery and calm, that sense that you've stepped out of ordinary time into something different. Some of it is surely the power of ritual, tradition, and belief. But some of it, science now tells us, might just be those ancient compounds working their subtle magic on your brain. Picture a time when every sip of water felt like rolling dice with death itself. Medieval folks faced a choice that seems almost impossible to us today. They could drink from wells that might be tainted, or streams that flowed cheerfully past grazing animals, carrying all sorts of unpleasant surprises downstream. Or they could reach for something with a bit of fermentation magic worked into it. This wasn't really a choice at all. Water could kill you, slowly and unpleasantly. So people turned to drinks that bubbled and fizzed with life, drinks that had been transformed by time and nature into something safer. Small beer became the drink of survival, a liquid lifeline that kept entire communities healthy and hydrated. Think about this for a moment. Children would wake up each morning and drink beer for breakfast, not to feel tipsy, but simply to avoid getting sick. Adults carried it to work in the fields, sipped it during meals, and shared it with guests. This wasn't about celebration or escape. It was about making it through another day without your stomach turning inside out. The brewing process itself had become a kind of neighborhood art form. Behind every house, wooden barrels sat patiently, transforming simple ingredients into liquid safety. Women named things like Edith or Margot would measure grains with their hands, trusting instinct over precision. They'd learned from mothers and grandmothers who had learned the same way, passing down knowledge that kept families alive. These home brewers worked with whatever they could find. Barley, oats, sometimes wheat if times were good. They'd add herbs they'd gathered from meadows, honey when they could afford it, spices if they were particularly prosperous. Each batch tasted different from the last because consistency wasn't the goal. Safety was. But medieval drinking wasn't all about survival. Those with deeper pockets and lighter responsibilities could indulge in stronger pleasures. Honey mead flowed at celebrations, thick and golden, carrying the sweetness of summer into the darkest winter months. Wine arrived from distant lands, precious and complex, often mixed with mysterious herbs that promised everything from better health to improved mood. The wealthy would experiment with their drinks like alchemists. They'd steep wine with cinnamon and cloves, creating warming potions for cold evenings. They'd mix in strange botanicals, hoping to cure everything from headaches to heartbreak. Sometimes these concoctions worked wonderfully, sometimes they didn't. But the experimentation never stopped. Meanwhile, in the quiet stone halls of monasteries, something remarkable was happening. Monks had turned brewing into a sacred practice, treating each batch like a prayer made liquid. They kept detailed records, noting which combinations worked best, which techniques produced the clearest results. These holy brewers tasted their creations with the dedication of scholars, always seeking perfection in their pious pursuit of the perfect pint. The Benedictines became legendary for their brewing skills, creating ales that could make even the most devoted skeptic believe in divine intervention. They understood fermentation in ways that seemed almost magical to outsiders, coaxing grain and water into liquid gold through patience and faith. Alcohol served purposes that went far beyond simple thirst quenching. When medieval dentistry meant little more than yanking teeth with crude tools, a strong ale could dull the agony. When winter depression settled over entire villages, spiced wine offered warmth and hope. When life in cramped quarters with too many people and judgmental farm animals became unbearable, mead provided a gentle escape. Taverns and roadside alehouses became the beating hearts of medieval communities. These weren't just places to drink. They were where news traveled, where deals were struck, where sorrows were shared, and joys celebrated. People gathered around wooden tables, raising their cups to mark births and deaths, successful harvests and narrow escapes from disaster. In these smoky, crowded spaces, alcohol loosened tongues and lifted spirits. Conversations flowed as freely as the ale, carrying gossip from neighboring towns, stories of distant lands, theories about everything from weather patterns to royal scandals. Sometimes the evening would dissolve into singing, sometimes into heated debates that everyone would regret. In the morning, dancing often erupted spontaneously, fueled by drink and the simple human need for joy in difficult times. These weren't choreographed performances, but wild, improvised celebrations of being alive in a world that offered few guarantees beyond the next sunrise. The medieval relationship with alcohol reveals something profound about human adaptability. Faced with dangerous water supplies, people didn't simply accept their fate. They found a solution that not only kept them healthy, but brought communities together, created traditions, and added moments of pleasure to lives that could be brutally hard. This daily dependence on fermented drinks shaped entire cultures, influencing everything from architecture to social customs. Brewhouses became essential buildings in every settlement. Drinking customs developed elaborate rituals and rules. The rhythm of daily life revolved around production cycles and seasonal ingredients. Picture this. You wake up one morning in medieval Europe, ready for your usual breakfast of fresh-baked bread. You take a bite, then another. Within hours, your world transforms into something unimaginable. Your hands feel like they're burning from the inside. Colors dance before your eyes, and you're convinced, absolutely convinced, that spiders are crawling out of your fingers. This wasn't witchcraft. This wasn't divine punishment. This was just Tuesday morning, thanks to a tiny fungus called ergot. Ergot had a peculiar talent for disguise. It would sneak onto rye crops, masquerading as normal grain kernels. Sure, they looked a bit darker, maybe a little odd, but hunger has a way of making people less picky about their food. Medieval farmers would harvest their rye, grind it into flour, and bake it into bread, never suspecting they were creating accidental psychedelic meals for entire communities. The thing about ergot is that it contains natural compounds remarkably similar to LSD. Centuries before anyone knew what LSD even was, European villagers were experiencing trips that would make modern festival goers jealous. Except, of course, these medieval folks had no idea what was happening to them. When ergot poisoning struck, it came in two delightful varieties. The first was convulsive ergotism. People would writhe with muscle spasms, laugh uncontrollably, then scream in terror. They'd see things that weren't there, hear voices from nowhere, and sometimes dance for days without stopping. Imagine trying to explain that to your medieval doctor. The second type was even more medieval horror movie material. Gangrenous ergotism would cut off blood flow to people's extremities. Hands and feet would turn black, shrivel up, and simply fall off. People would literally lose their limbs to breakfast bread. These outbreaks created some of the strangest phenomena in medieval history. Entire towns would suddenly break into frenzied dancing that could last for weeks. People called them dancing plagues, and they'd spread from person to person like some kind of rhythmic infection. Some dancers collapsed from exhaustion. Others danced themselves to death. The medieval mind, naturally, reached for supernatural explanations. Demons were possessing people. God was angry about something. Perhaps the local witch had cursed the harvest. Nobody thought to examine the grain more closely. What's fascinating is how geography played a role in this accidental drug distribution. Ergot thrived in cold, damp conditions. So regions like northern France and Germanic territories became hotspots for these mysterious outbreaks. Southern Europe, with its warmer, drier climate, remained relatively ergot-free. People probably wondered why northerners seemed so prone to strange fits and visions. The irony gets even better when you consider the cure. The Order of St. Anthony ran hospitals specifically for ergot victims, though they didn't know that's what they were treating. Their remedy was beautifully simple. They fed patients wheat bread instead of rye bread. Different grain, different breakfast, different reality. People would arrive hallucinating and convulsing, then gradually return to normal after switching their carbohydrate source. Medieval bakers lived in a world where bread was either perfectly fine or obviously cursed by dark forces. There was no middle ground for, maybe this grain has some unusual biological properties we should investigate. The scientific method was still centuries away from being invented. Some historians wonder if ergot traveled across the Atlantic to influence American history too. The Salem witch trials featured young girls experiencing fits, hallucinations, and strange behavior, all symptoms that align perfectly with ergot poisoning. New England's climate was certainly suitable for ergot growth, but this theory remains hotly debated among scholars. What we do know is that ergot shaped medieval life in ways most people never realized. It influenced religious experiences, social upheavals, and medical practices. Entire communities would share collective altered states of consciousness, all because a fungus decided to hitch a ride on their breakfast grain. The medieval world was already strange enough without accidental psychedelic experiences. People lived with constant uncertainty about disease, war, and famine. Adding unpredictable hallucinogenic episodes to daily life must have felt like the universe playing a particularly elaborate prank. Modern science eventually identified ergot and its effects, but for centuries, European communities lived with this invisible chemical wildcard in their food supply. One day you're a normal medieval peasant, the next day you're convinced your neighbor has turned into a talking goat, and your hands are melting. Nature has always had a peculiar sense of humor when it comes to the things we put in our mouths. Sometimes the most innocent-looking treats carry the wildest surprises, waiting patiently in mountain meadows for unsuspecting visitors. High up in the rugged mountains around the Black Sea, in what we now call Turkey, something extraordinary was happening in medieval times. The bees there had developed quite a different routine from their cousins elsewhere. Instead of the usual wildflowers, these industrious little creatures had discovered the abundant rhododendron blooms that carpeted the steep hillsides. Those pink flowers, pretty as they were, held a chemical secret. Deep within their petals lived compounds called grey-inotoxins, natural substances that could turn an ordinary afternoon into something far more memorable. The bees, seemingly unbothered by these chemicals, went about their work as usual, collecting nectar and transforming it into honey. But this wasn't just any honey. When people tasted it, strange things began to happen. First came the dizziness, that gentle spinning sensation that made the world feel slightly off balance. Then the heart would slow down, beating with an unusual heavy rhythm that seemed to echo in their ears. To some, the experience brought visions, strange dreams that danced behind their eyelids while they were still awake. Others found themselves sick to their stomachs, their bodies rejecting this peculiar gift from nature. The locals called it mad honey, and they learned to treat it with a mixture of respect and curiosity. Word of this unusual substance spread beyond the mountain villages. Ancient writers like Xenophon documented its effects, describing soldiers who stumbled upon abandoned stores of the honey and paid dearly for their discovery. These weren't locals who understood the proper way to handle such a potent substance, but foreign invaders who saw only free food and took it without question. The honey became a weapon of sorts, left behind deliberately when villages had to be abandoned. Approaching armies would find these sweet treasures and consume them greedily, only to find themselves helpless hours later, convulsing on the ground while the world spun around them in slow motion. But for those who knew its secrets, mad honey served different purposes entirely. A tiny amount spread on bread might ease a persistent headache. A small spoonful mixed into wine could bring on mystical experiences, visions that some believed carried messages from beyond the physical world. The dosage made all the difference, of course. Too little, and nothing much happened beyond a slight tingling sensation. Too much, and a person might spend the day convinced that everyday objects had taken on lives of their own, perhaps having deep conversations with a piece of fruit, or becoming emotionally attached to a household tool. Folk healers incorporated the honey into their practices, using it to treat various ailments or to induce the trance-like states they believed opened doorways to spiritual insights. Some users reported prophetic dreams after consuming small amounts, vivid nighttime journeys that seemed to reveal glimpses of future events. Merchants eventually caught wind of this unusual product and began trading it in small clay vessels. They carried it along trade routes, selling it to curious buyers who had heard whispers of its remarkable properties. Of course, these early salesmen rarely provided much in the way of instructions or warnings. After all, this was an era when medical advice often involved bloodletting and various questionable remedies. The idea of carefully measured doses or safety warnings hadn't quite caught on yet. People were expected to learn through experience, sometimes pleasant, sometimes decidedly less so. The honey's reputation grew over the centuries, becoming part of the folklore and traditional medicine of the region. Stories passed from generation to generation, tales of warriors brought low by their own greed, of mystics who found wisdom in its effects, and of ordinary people who learned to respect the power hidden in something as simple as honey from mountain flowers. Even today, in remote corners of that same region, bees continued their ancient work among the rhododendron blooms, creating their potent honey just as their ancestors did centuries ago. The flowers still bloom pink and innocent-looking, still carrying their chemical secrets, still offering their strange gifts to those brave enough or foolish enough to accept them. Picture a world where healing meant something entirely different than what we know today. In medieval times, there existed a fascinating group of people who lived somewhere between the official world and the shadows. They weren't the grand physicians with their Latin books, and they certainly weren't the priests with their holy remedies. These were the cunning folk, the wise women, the herbalists who operated in society's quiet corners. When your tooth ached terribly, and the local doctor wanted to drain your blood, you might find yourself seeking out these mysterious figures instead. They had no fancy degrees hanging on their walls, no official recognition from any authority. What they possessed was something far more valuable, knowledge that had traveled through countless generations, whispered from grandmother to granddaughter, passed down like precious family heirlooms. These practitioners had an almost mystical relationship with the natural world around them. They understood moss in ways that seem almost supernatural to us now. They knew exactly which bark could soothe a painful boil, which roots needed to soak in wine for just the right amount of time, and most remarkably, how much of any given plant would send you into heavenly dreams, rather than, sending you to meet the angels permanently. The world of medieval medicine was a strange and wondrous place, where the line between healing and magic blurred like watercolors in the rain. These folk healers served as the original underground pharmacists, completely unregulated, guided only by tradition and intuition. They mixed their remedies with whatever they had on hand: wine, animal fat, honey, and yes, sometimes even spit. It sounds bizarre to our modern ears, but in their world, it made perfect sense. Many of these mysterious healers were women, midwives and wise women, who became the backbone of their communities. They delivered babies, treated illnesses, and provided comfort when official medicine failed, yet they lived under constant suspicion from those in power. Not because they were brewing evil potions in bubbling cauldrons, but because they possessed knowledge that couldn't be controlled or easily understood by authorities who preferred their wisdom written in Latin. The plants they worked with read like a medieval apothecary's dream journal. Henbane, with its ability to transport minds to other realms. Mandrake, shrouded in folklore and mystery. Belladonna, beautiful and dangerous in equal measure. Poppy derivatives that could ease the most terrible pain. These weren't random choices, but carefully selected ingredients that had proven themselves effective over centuries of use. When someone came seeking help, whether for physical pain, spiritual visions, or even to settle scores with difficult neighbors, these practitioners had remedies ready. They might prepare something for an out-of-body experience during the most mundane daily tasks, like doing laundry. The idea that transcendence could happen anywhere, even while washing clothes, speaks to a worldview where the mystical and everyday intertwined constantly. The relationship between communities and these healers was beautifully complex. People needed them desperately, yet feared them intensely. When a child burned with fever, when old joints screamed with pain, or when someone desperately needed to contact a deceased relative about hidden money. These were the people everyone turned to. They filled gaps that official medicine and religion couldn't touch. But this existence came with tremendous risks. If a remedy went wrong, if someone experienced unexpected hallucinations involving flying goats, or suddenly felt compelled to marry a tree, the blame shifted quickly from simple human error to accusations of witchcraft. The church and local authorities watched these practitioners with nervous suspicion, one eye observing, the other twitching with anxiety about powers they couldn't control or understand. What's remarkable is how these people persisted, despite the dangers. They weren't trying to replace doctors or priests. They were creating their own unique space in society. They understood that healing involved more than just treating symptoms. It required connecting with forces and knowledge that couldn't be found in any official textbook. These folk operated with a wisdom that seems almost alien to our modern, regulated world. They trusted in plant knowledge that had survived famines, plagues, and social upheavals. They believed in the power of ritual words, protective phrases that would shield both healer and patient from harm. Their practice was as much about community connection as it was about individual healing. In many ways, these shadowy figures represented humanity's oldest relationship with medicine and mystery. They remind us of a time when healing was deeply personal, when remedies were crafted individually, and when the boundary between the physical and spiritual worlds was gossamer thin. They were the original practitioners who understood that sometimes the most powerful medicine comes not from official sources, but from the quiet wisdom of those who dare to work in the margins. Picture a world where your local healer might hand you a cup of something that would, well, let's just say it would do more than cure your headache. Medieval people found themselves in quite the pickle when it came to substances that altered the mind. They wanted relief from their endless parade of ailments, but they also lived under the watchful eye of a church that had very strong opinions about losing control of your faculties. The healers and herbalists, these were the practical folks of their time. They looked at their patients writhing in pain, burning with fever, or facing the absolute terror of medieval childbirth, and they thought, if this root or that brew can help, then so be it. They didn't much care if their patient started babbling about cats speaking in foreign tongues, as long as the medicine worked. Success was measured in results, not in how coherent you sounded afterward. There was something beautifully straightforward about their approach. Pain was the enemy, and whatever fought pain was a friend. If someone's leg was broken, and a particular mixture made them forget about it for a while, that was good medicine. The side effects, the strange visions, the odd behavior, these were just part of the package deal. But then you had the spiritual seekers, the monks tucked away in their monasteries, the mystics wandering the countryside. For these people, altered states weren't accidents or side effects. They were the whole point. When they saw visions, heard voices, or felt themselves transported to other realms, they didn't think something had gone wrong. They thought something had gone beautifully right. These folks believed they were getting direct messages from the divine. If you stared into empty space and suddenly heard celestial choirs, or if the walls of your cell began showing you scenes from paradise, well, that was evidence of your holiness. The church had a complicated relationship with this. Some visions were celebrated, turned into stories of saints and miracles. Others were viewed with deep suspicion. The key was intent, and this is where things got deliciously complicated. If you accidentally consumed something that made you see things, the church might shrug and call it God's will. If you deliberately sought visions to commune with the divine, they might nod approvingly and start planning your biography. But if you seemed to be chasing after experiences that led you toward darker territory, toward conversations with entities that definitely weren't angels, then suddenly you had a very serious problem on your hands. The church drew these invisible lines everywhere. Saints could have visions, but peasants having the same experiences were probably just possessed. Holy men could speak in tongues, but common folk doing the same thing were clearly up to no good. It was a system that depended entirely on who you were and what people thought of your character. Meanwhile, ordinary people were living their lives with a much more relaxed attitude toward all of this. Your neighbor might brew something to help with sleep, that also happened to take your mind on interesting journeys. The village-wise woman might recommend a tea that calmed your nerves and also made the colors seem more vivid. This wasn't mystical or rebellious behavior. It was just practical living. People dealt with pain using poppy preparations. They found peace with various herbs. They managed their daily stress with whatever nature provided. These weren't spiritual quests or acts of defiance. They were simply tools in the medicine chest, sitting right next to more conventional remedies. The fascinating thing is how context shaped everything. The same substance could be medicine, miracle or menace, depending on who was using it, why they were using it, and who happened to be watching. A monk's divine vision and a peasant's hallucination might have looked identical, but one would be celebrated while the other would be condemned. This created a strange world where altered states of consciousness existed in this murky space, between acceptable and forbidden, between healing and heresy, between divine gift and dangerous mistake. People navigated this carefully, understanding that their experiences might be interpreted very differently depending on their social position and the circumstances. In a time when life was filled with so many genuine terrors, when disease, war, and famine were constant companions, when the line between the natural and assumed thin anyway, perhaps it's not surprising that people had such complex relationships with substances that offered escape or insight. After all, in a world where demons and saints seemed equally real, where plagues could wipe out entire communities and strange weather could destroy all your crops, a little chemical assistance in dealing with reality didn't seem like the most unreasonable thing you could do. In those ancient times, people understood something we might forget today. The ocean wasn't just water stretching to the horizon, it was power itself, flowing between continents. Every wave carried the potential for fortune, or complete ruin. Picture the Mediterranean back then, this vast liquid highway connecting Africa, Europe, and Asia. Merchants would load their ships with Egyptian grain, Phoenician purple dye, and Spanish silver. But these weren't just business trips. Every voyage was a gamble with destiny itself. The sea brought messages faster than any horse could gallop across mountains and deserts. A fleet could carry news of victory or defeat from one end of the known world to the other. Kings would wait anxiously at harbors, scanning the horizon for sails that might change everything. When Athens decided to become a sea power, they weren't just building ships. They were reshaping their entire civilization. Thousands of citizens would row together, their oars moving like clockwork, transforming ordinary men into instruments of empire. These weren't just boats, they were floating fortresses, each one capable of ramming through enemy hulls or launching bronze-tipped arrows across the waves. The Athenians discovered something remarkable about naval warfare. On land, mountains and rivers decided where armies could march, but at sea, skill and cunning mattered more than geography. A clever admiral could appear anywhere along an enemy coastline, striking where least expected, then vanishing back into the blue. Carthage took a different path to maritime dominance. Their ancestors had been traders, not warriors. Generation after generation, Carthaginian families had sailed beyond the Pillars of Hercules, mapping coastlines and learning the sea's moods. When they finally built war fleets, they brought centuries of nautical wisdom with them. The Carthaginian shipyards became legendary across the ancient world. Imagine massive harbor complexes where hundreds of vessels took shape simultaneously. Workers would swarm over wooden skeletons, transforming timber and bronze into instruments of war. The sound of hammers and saws echoed day and night as an entire civilization dedicated itself to ruling the waves. Egypt's relationship with water ran even deeper. The Nile wasn't just their lifeline, it was their highway to the gods. Egyptian ships would sail south into Nubia, returning laden with gold and exotic animals for Pharaoh's court. But they also had to venture into the Mediterranean, protecting their merchants from pirates who lurked among the islands. These weren't simple wooden boats anymore. Egyptian naval architects learned to build vessels that could handle river currents and ocean swells equally well. Their warships carried specially trained marines, soldiers who could fight on deck while waves crashed around them. What's fascinating is how these naval powers thought about control. They didn't just want to win battles, they wanted to strangle their enemies slowly. A successful blockade could starve an entire city without ever setting foot on land. Grain ships from Egypt might never reach their destination. Silver from Spain could disappear into the depths. The sea became a chessboard, where empires moved their pieces across vast distances. A fleet positioned near important trade routes could collect tribute from passing merchants. Another squadron might escort friendly vessels while hunting enemy ships like wolves, tracking prey. Naval commanders had to master skills unknown to land generals. They needed to read wind patterns, understand how currents could carry them toward victory or disaster. The best admirals could predict weather days in advance, positioning their fleets to strike when conditions favored them most. Sometimes entire civilizations would rise or fall based on a single day's fighting at sea. Ships would crash together in clouds of splinters and spray, Marines leaping across narrow gaps to fight hand-to-hand on blood-slicked decks. The winners would sail home as heroes, while the defeated might never see land again. These maritime empires invested everything in their fleets because they understood a simple truth: control the sea, and you control the future. Lose that control, and even the mightiest cities could find themselves isolated, cut off from the flowing currents of trade and communication that made civilization possible. The ancient world's greatest powers all learned this lesson, some through triumph, others through catastrophe. The sea remembered everything, carrying the echoes of their victories and defeats across generations, shaping the destiny of everyone who dared to call themselves masters of the waves. Picture a world where the fate of entire civilizations hung on the rhythm of wooden oars cutting through ancient waters. These weren't just boats, mind you. They were floating instruments of power, sleek and deadly, designed for one purpose: to change the course of history. The trireme, as it came to be known, measured roughly 120 feet from bow to stern. That's about as long as 3 school buses, lined up end to end. But here's the curious thing: it was only 18 feet wide. Imagine trying to balance on something that narrow, while waves crash around you, and enemy ships bear down from all directions. This wasn't an accident of design, though. That slender profile, it was everything. Like a knife blade through butter, these vessels could slice through water with almost supernatural grace. The shallow draft meant they could hug coastlines, appearing suddenly from hidden coves, striking before anyone knew what hit them. 3 rows of oars, stacked one above the other, gave the trireme its name. Each level held dozens of rowers, ordinary citizens mostly, who had trained their entire lives for this moment. They moved as one organism, their oars hitting the water in perfect synchronization. When everything worked just right, these ships could reach 9 knots in battle conditions. That might not sound fast by today's standards, but in the ancient world, it was like watching lightning cross the sea. The real terror, though, came from the front of the ship. A massive bronze ram, shaped like a spear point, jutted forward from the bow. Behind that bronze sheath lay solid oak timbers, reinforced and weighted. When a skilled captain aimed this weapon at an enemy hull, the results were catastrophic. Wood splintered, bronze bent, and sailors found themselves swimming among the wreckage of their dreams. But ramming another ship, that took more than just courage. It required the kind of precision that comes only from years of practice. Hit your target straight on, and your own ship might get trapped in the wreckage. Hit at the wrong angle, and you could flip your own vessel. The best captains, particularly those sailing under Athenian colors, developed something called the Deiclus. Picture this: your ship threading through a line of enemy vessels, oars pulling in perfect rhythm, then suddenly wheeling around to strike an exposed flank. It was like watching a deadly dance, performed on waters that could swallow you whole. Above deck, small groups of Marines waited for their moment. 10, maybe 20 heavily armed warriors, their bronze armor glinting in the Mediterranean sun. Some carried the long spears and round shields of the hoplite tradition. Others preferred bows, raining arrows down on enemy crews. Their job was simple enough: board enemy ships when the opportunity arose, or keep enemy boarders from taking your own vessel. These weren't floating castles though. No thick walls, no heavy armor plating. Everything about the triremes screamed speed and agility. One mistake, one moment of hesitation, and you became driftwood, floating on an indifferent sea. What made Athens different wasn't just that they built these ships. Lots of Mediterranean cities had triremes. The difference lay in how the Athenians thought about naval power. They created something called the Therica, essentially a public fund dedicated entirely to building and maintaining their fleet. Hundreds of these vessels, all funded by the state, all crewed by citizens. Here's where it gets interesting from a social perspective. The rowers weren't slaves or prisoners. They were free citizens, many of them quite poor, who found purpose and identity in service to their city. Democracy, it turned out, worked just as well at sea as it did in the public squares of Athens. When the Persian Empire sent its massive fleet against the Greek city-states in 480 BCE, it wasn't nobles or aristocrats who saved the day at Salamis. It was ordinary people, working-class citizens who had spent countless hours perfecting their craft. They understood that their individual survival depended entirely on working together, trusting each other, moving as one unified force against overwhelming odds. The battle itself must have been something to witness. Hundreds of ships maneuvering in the narrow straits near Athens, bronze rams seeking wooden targets, while the fate of Western civilization hung in the balance. When the dust settled, or rather when the waves calmed, it was clear that something fundamental had changed. Naval warfare would never be quite the same, and neither would the balance of power in the ancient world. Picture this, if you will, the ancient Mediterranean, where war at sea looked nothing like what you might imagine. These weren't the thunderous cannon battles of later centuries, but something far more intimate, and perhaps more terrifying. The ocean became a stage for what could only be described as high-speed chess, played with wooden ships and human lives. The heart of ancient naval warfare, you see, rested on a single devastating principle: ramming. Every warship carried at its front a bronze-tipped prow, designed for one purpose: to punch through enemy hulls below the waterline. It sounds simple enough, doesn't it? But the reality was far more complex, far more delicate. A successful ram required perfect timing, the right angle, flawless coordination. Too sharp an approach, and your bronze tip would simply glance off the enemy hull, leaving you vulnerable and exposed. Too direct, and you'd find your own ship embedded in theirs, locked together like two angry animals, both now sitting ducks for other vessels prowling nearby. The ancient commanders knew this, of course, and so they developed maneuvers that sound almost like dance steps. There was something called the diekplus, where a ship would tread through gaps in the enemy battle line, then wheel around to strike from behind. Imagine the courage required, sailing directly into a formation of enemy warships, trusting entirely in your rower's skill and your captain's judgment. Then there was the periplus, a sweeping circular movement designed to outflank entire formations, hitting the enemy where they least expected it. These tactics demanded incredible synchronization. Every rower pulling in perfect rhythm. Every captain reading the battle like a master chess player reads the board. But here's the thing about ancient warfare. Things rarely went according to plan. Rams missed their targets, ships collided at awkward angles, oars snapped under pressure. When the elegant choreography of naval combat broke down, when ramming failed or ships became entangled, that's when the real brutality began. Boarding, they called it, and it transformed these floating chess matches into something far more primal. Marines would leap from ship to ship, swords and spears in hand, turning wooden decks into battlefields. Picture it. Close quarters combat on a platform that rocks and rolls with every wave, where footing meant the difference between life and death. These boarding actions weren't the stuff of romantic adventure stories. They were brutal, desperate affairs, more like gang fights than military engagements. Archers and slingers positioned on the upper decks would rain down projectiles, picking off anyone who showed too much of their helmet above the chaos. Some civilizations, the Romans in particular, eventually embraced this chaotic style of naval combat. They understood something important. They were the world's best sailors, but they were absolutely devastating infantry fighters. So they invented devices like the Corvus, essentially a boarding plank with a wicked spike that could hook onto enemy vessels, turning sea battles into land battles, fought on floating platforms. This innovation helped Rome defeat the far more experienced Carthaginian sailors during their first great naval war. What the Romans lacked in seamanship, in the elegant art of ramming and maneuvering, they more than made up for in sheer brutal infantry prowess. But this shift toward boarding combat came with a terrible cost. Naval battles became bloodier, more chaotic, more personal. Once Marines began leaping between ships, there was no elegant withdrawal, no strategic retreat. It became kill or be killed on decks that grew slick with salt water, blood, and the debris of shattered equipment. The common sailors and Marines, the ordinary people who fought these battles, found themselves in a unique form of hell. They couldn't run from a sea battle the way soldiers might flee a land engagement. Surrounded by water, locked in combat on a wooden platform, they had nowhere to go but forward, into whatever violence awaited them on the enemy deck. Long ago, when ships ruled the world's waters, there was something that struck more terror into sailors' hearts than any sword or spear. Fire. Picture this. You're standing on the deck of your wooden vessel, scanning the horizon for threats. Suddenly, through the morning mist, you see it, a ship, completely engulfed in flames, heading straight toward your fleet. Fire at sea wasn't just about destruction, it was about pure, raw panic. While ramming ships required skill and precision, fire was different. Fire was chaos unleashed upon the waves. It didn't need perfect timing or expert seamanship. It just needed to reach its target. The concept was beautifully simple, yet terrifyingly effective. Ancient naval commanders would take an old ship, sometimes one that was already damaged or past its prime. They'd stuff it full of everything that loved to burn: pitch, that sticky black substance that coated ship hulls; tar, thick and smoky; sulfur, with its distinctive choking smell; resin from pine trees; oil from wherever they could find it. Then came the moment of truth. Someone, usually a volunteer who knew he might not make it back, would light the whole thing ablaze. The ship would become a floating inferno, drifting toward enemy lines, like a nightmare made real. These fireships worked best in tight spaces, harbor entrances, narrow straits, places where enemy fleets couldn't easily scatter. Imagine being trapped in a confined waterway, your ships packed close together for mutual protection. Then suddenly, this burning death trap comes floating into your midst. Panic spreads faster than the flames themselves. Sailors abandon their posts. Captains shout contradictory orders. Ships crash into each other trying to escape. The Greeks were among the first to really understand this weapon's power. During their conflicts with the mighty Persian Empire, desperate defenders would send flaming rafts and boats toward the invading galleys. Sometimes these were nothing more than fishing boats, packed with combustible materials and pushed out to sea by brave volunteers. But fire at sea was a gamble, a roll of the dice that could go horribly wrong. Wind, that invisible master of the oceans, could shift without warning. A fire ship meant to destroy your enemies could suddenly turn back toward your own fleet. Many a commander learned this lesson the hard way, watching helplessly as their own weapon of chaos consumed their vessels instead. This unpredictability meant fire was usually saved for special occasions. Desperate sieges, where defenders had nothing left to lose; surprise attacks under cover of darkness, when confusion would multiply the weapon's effect; last stands where the choice was between certain defeat and a risky gambit that might just work. The Egyptians, masters of the ancient Mediterranean, developed their own versions of fire warfare. They'd use catapults to hurl burning pots filled with flammable substances. These fire pots would shatter on enemy decks, spreading their burning contents across wood and rope and sail. Egyptian coastal defenders became particularly skilled at this, protecting their harbors from pirates and invaders. The Phoenicians, those great traders and sailors, also embraced fire as a naval weapon. They'd launch flaming arrows from specialized bows, aiming for sails and rigging. A single well-placed fire arrow could bring down a mast, disable a ship, or force an entire crew to abandon their vessel. But perhaps the most fascinating development in ancient fire warfare came from an unexpected direction. The Byzantines, inheritors of Roman naval traditions, created something truly extraordinary. They called it Greek fire, though by then it was more medieval than ancient. This mysterious substance could allegedly burn on water itself, something that seemed impossible to enemy sailors, who watched in horror as the sea around their ships literally caught fire. Greek fire couldn't be put out with water, the one thing sailors had plenty of. Instead, it had to be smothered with sand or dirt, neither of which was easy to find in the middle of the ocean. The exact recipe for Greek fire was such a closely guarded secret that we still don't know precisely how it was made. Some think it involved petroleum. Others suggest a mixture of sulfur and saltpeter. Whatever its components, Greek fire gave the Byzantine navy a terrifying advantage for centuries. The psychological impact of fire at sea went far beyond its physical damage. Experienced sailors, men who had faced storms and sea monsters and enemy weapons, would flee in terror at the first sign of flames. There was something primal about it, something that spoke to humanity's deepest fears. You could defend against a ramming ship by turning to meet it head-on, presenting your own reinforced prow for the collision. You could repel boarders with swords and spears, fighting them off in hand-to-hand combat. But fire was different. Fire consumed everything in its path. It turned mighty warships into floating pyres. It spread faster than human reflexes, devoured wooden hulls like a hungry beast, and filled the air with choking smoke that made it impossible to see or breathe. Even the bravest warriors would abandon ship when they smelled that distinctive mixture of burning pitch and smoke. Ship captains, men trained to go down with their vessels if necessary, would order immediate retreat when fire ships appeared on the horizon. This terror wasn't just superstition or cowardice. Fire at sea was genuinely one of the most dangerous things ancient sailors could face. Wooden ships, coated in flammable substances and filled with rope and canvas, were essentially floating tinderboxes. Once fire took hold, it could spread through an entire vessel in minutes. Crews had no choice but to jump overboard and hope for rescue, watching helplessly as months of work and years of wages went up in smoke. The legacy of these ancient fire tactics echoed through naval history for centuries to come. Every innovation in incendiary warfare, from medieval Greek fire to later developments, could trace its roots back to those first brave souls who loaded old ships with pitch and tar, lit them ablaze, and sent them drifting toward enemy fleets. Imagine, if you will, a world where the glint of silver could change everything. Deep beneath the rocky hills of ancient Greece, miners struck something extraordinary. Not just any silver, mind you, but veins so rich they practically gleamed in the torchlight. This wasn't just precious metal, this was destiny wrapped in ore. Now picture the scene in Athens. Citizens gathering in the agora, voices rising and falling like waves. Some wanted to divvy up this newfound wealth, put coins in every pocket, make everyone a little richer for a little while. But there was this politician, this visionary named Themistocles, who saw something bigger. He looked at that silver and saw ships. Not just any ships, but sleek wooden predators called triremes. The beauty of a trireme, you see, lay in its simplicity and deadliness. Picture a vessel built for speed, with 3 rows of oars cutting through Mediterranean waters like synchronized heartbeats. These weren't cargo ships or fishing boats. These were instruments of power, floating extensions of Athenian will. When the citizens finally agreed to build this fleet, they unknowingly planted seeds of empire. 200 warships, give or take, suddenly appeared in Athenian harbors. The sound of hammering, the smell of fresh timber, the sight of bronze-tipped rams being fitted to prowl, It must have been intoxicating. But silver and ships mean nothing without the moment to use them. That moment came when Persian vessels darkened the horizon, carrying the ambitions of an empire that stretched from India to Egypt. The Persians had numbers, they had experience, they had the confidence of conquerors. What they didn't have was local knowledge. The waters around Salamis tell their own story. Narrow straits where maneuverability mattered more than mass, where smaller, nimbler ships could dance around lumbering giants. The Athenians didn't just win that day, they orchestrated a massacre. Persian ships, trapped and confused, became floating kindling. The sea itself seemed to choose sides. Victory at Salamis did more than save Athens. It announced the arrival of a new kind of power. Land had always been king in the ancient world. Fertile fields, defensible hills, these determined a city's fate. But now, suddenly, the sea offered its own possibilities. Control the waves, and you could reach anywhere, influence anyone, project strength across vast distances. The Delian League started as something noble, or at least defensible. Greek cities banding together, pooling resources, preparing for the next Persian invasion that might never come. Athens, naturally, would coordinate this effort. After all, they had the ships, the experience, the infrastructure. What could go wrong? Everything, as it turned out. Tribute flowed into Athenian coffers like rivers converging into a lake, gold and silver from islands and coastal cities, all supposedly for the common defense. But defense has a funny way of looking like aggression when you're on the receiving end. Those beautiful temples on the Athenian Acropolis, those marble columns that still take your breath away, they were built with other people's money. The triremes became collection agents, floating reminders of what happened to cities that forgot their obligations. When Naxos tried to leave the League, Athenian ships appeared on the horizon like storm clouds. The message was clear: membership had its privileges, but leaving had its consequences. Yet something remarkable happened in Athens during these years of naval dominance. The poorest citizens, men who owned no land, who couldn't afford the bronze armor of a hoplite, suddenly found themselves essential. Every trireme needed rowers, lots of them, and rowing required no equipment beyond strong backs and willing hearts. These men, the Thetes as they were called, discovered that their calloused hands could pull more than oars. They could pull political levers too. When the assembly met, their voices carried new weight. After all, how do you ignore the men who power your empire? Democracy, that Athenian invention, deepened and broadened on the backs of naval power. The irony is delicious, really. An instrument of imperial domination became a tool of domestic liberation. The same ships that enforced Athens's will across the Aegean also gave voice to its voiceless citizens. The oar and the vote became strangely intertwined. But empires, like storms, carry the seeds of their own destruction. Every tribute collected bred resentment. Every rebellion created two new enemies. Athens began to look less like a protector and more like a bully, less like a leader and more like a tyrant. The very allies who had once welcomed Athenian ships now watched the horizon with dread. Sparta, that most landlocked of powers, observed all this with growing alarm. The Spartans understood land warfare like farmers understand seasons. But they also understood necessity, and necessity taught them to think like sailors. With Persian gold, that old enemy became a new friend. They began building their own fleet. The final act played out at a place called Aigos Potami. Imagine the Athenian sailors, confident in their superiority, perhaps a little careless after so many victories. They beached their ships for the night, scattered to find food and rest. The Spartan fleet, patient as fishermen, waited for exactly this moment. When morning came, the Athenians found themselves trapped, their ships vulnerable, their crews scattered. In minutes, decades of naval supremacy vanished like morning mist. The same waters that had carried Athenian power to every corner of the Greek world now carried news of its destruction. Without their fleet, the Athenians discovered just how much their empire had depended on those wooden walls. Trade routes closed, allies abandoned them, tribute stopped flowing. The city that had ruled the waves found itself starving behind its stone walls, reduced to eating whatever the besiegers allowed through. The lesson, perhaps, lies not in the rise or fall, but in the reminder that power is always temporary. Those silver veins in Laurium eventually ran dry. The triremes rotted at their moorings. The empire crumbled into memory, but the idea remained. The understanding that mastery of the sea could transform a small city into a great power, that ships could be tools of politics as much as war. Even today, when we watch modern navies patrol distant waters, we're seeing echoes of that ancient Athenian insight. The silver is gone, the triremes are museum pieces, but the principle endures. Control the pathways, and you control the possibilities. Picture a city rising from the North African coast around 800 years before the Common Era, where Phoenician settlers gazed out at endless blue waters and saw not just the sea, but opportunity itself. This was Carthage, and it would become something extraordinary, something that would make the very waves tremble with its power. While other ancient powers built their strength through armies marching across dusty plains, Carthage chose a different path entirely. They understood something profound about the world, that water connects rather than divides, that ships could carry not just goods, but entire civilizations. Trade became their weapon, seafaring their art, and the Mediterranean their canvas. By the time 4 centuries had passed, Carthage wasn't simply another wealthy port city dotting the coastline. It had transformed into the beating heart of a maritime empire that stretched like fingers across the Western Sea, reaching from the sun-baked shores of Spain all the way to the island duels of Sicily and Sardinia. The secret to Carthaginian dominance lay floating in their harbors, hundreds upon hundreds of warships that bobbed like sleeping giants, ready to wake and rule the waves. While Athens had perfected their famous triremes with 3 banks of oars, Carthage took naval engineering and turned it into something resembling a modern factory. Their shipyards were marvels that would make even today's engineers pause in wonder. The great circular harbour of Carthage operated like an ancient assembly line, where skilled craftsmen could construct and repair vessels with a speed that left other nations speechless. This wasn't just impressive, it was revolutionary, a glimpse into the future wrapped in cedar wood and bronze. The ships themselves were monsters compared to their sleeker Athenian cousins. Carthaginian quadriremes and quinquiremes, cariremes, 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 chorals perceptively, vessels built not for graceful dancing across the water, but for crushing their enemies through sheer power. These floating fortresses embodied a naval philosophy that favored devastating ramming attacks and brutal boarding actions. Manning these ships were some of the finest sailors the ancient world ever produced. Libyan and Phoenician seamen, who had learned to read the wind's whispers and the sea's moods from childhood, working alongside seasoned mercenary marines who turned every deck into a battlefield. Together, they formed crews that other nations could only dream of matching. But Carthage's true genius wasn't found in warfare alone. It lived in the marriage of military might and commercial ambition. Their merchants were explorers who pushed beyond the familiar Mediterranean, sailing along the wild Atlantic coasts where few had dared to venture. They brought back tin from distant shores, silver that gleamed like captured moonlight, and exotic goods that sparked wonder in every port. The navy served as both sword and shield for this vast commercial network, ensuring that pirates lurking in hidden coves, rival traders, or the growing ambitions of Rome couldn't strangle the golden flow of commerce that fed Carthage's power. Then came the clash that would echo through history, the Punic Wars, where Rome looked across the water at Carthaginian dominance and decided it could no longer be tolerated. Rome faced a problem that seemed impossible. They needed to build a navy capable of challenging masters of the sea, starting essentially from nothing. Fortune smiled on Roman ambition when they discovered a stranded Carthaginian quinquireme, like finding a treasure map written in wood and rope. They studied every joint, every measurement, every secret of its construction, then set about copying it with the methodical precision that would become Rome's trademark. But the Romans added their own twist, a devastating boarding ramp called the Corvus, that could crash down onto enemy decks, transforming sea battles into the kind of brutal hand-to-hand combat where Roman legionaries excelled. Suddenly, Carthage's superior seamanship meant less when battles became floating sieges. Still, the masters of the Mediterranean didn't surrender their crown easily. Through the First Punic War, Carthaginian fleets fought with a brilliance that bordered on artistry. At the Battle of Trapana, they orchestrated a maneuver so perfect, so precisely timed, that they destroyed an entire Roman fleet, despite being outnumbered, proving that experience and skill could still triumph over raw numbers. Their naval commanders understood the sea like poets understand words, turning wind and current into allies, using the Mediterranean's moods as weapons against enemies who saw only water where Carthaginians saw possibility. Yet even the greatest artists must eventually face the harsh mathematics of war. Roman persistence proved as relentless as the tide. Their supply lines stretched like iron chains across the sea, their brutal discipline grinding down even Carthaginian excellence through sheer, stubborn endurance. By the time the Second Punic War reached its bloody conclusion, the Mediterranean had witnessed something that once seemed impossible. Carthage's proud fleets lay broken beneath the waves. Their revolutionary shipyards stood silent and empty, their maritime empire dissolved like sea foam on distant shores. The irony cuts deep when you consider it. That a civilization built on the freedom of open waters was ultimately destroyed by a land power that learned to swim. Carthage had created something beautiful and terrible, an empire that moved with the rhythms of tide and trade wind, but even the sea itself couldn't protect them from Rome's iron determination. Today, when we look out at any harbor filled with ships, we're seeing echoes of what Carthage pioneered, that marriage of commercial ambition and naval power that turned the Mediterranean from a barrier into a highway. They weren't simply warriors who happened to fight on water. They were visionaries who saw the future floating just beyond the horizon. Picture this. The ancient world wasn't just about land armies marching across dusty plains. No, some of the most fascinating stories unfolded on water, where civilizations rose and fell with the tide. Egypt, that land of golden sand and towering monuments, had secrets floating on its rivers and seas that most people never think about. You see, when we imagine ancient Egypt, we usually see those massive pyramids reaching toward the sky, or perhaps a pharaoh sitting on a golden throne. But there's another Egypt, one that lived and breathed on the water. The Nile River, that great ribbon of life cutting through the desert, wasn't just a source of water and fertile soil. It was Egypt's main highway, its lifeline, its path to power. Think about it for a moment. In a world without cars or trains, without paved roads stretching for miles, water became the fastest way to move anything important. And the Egyptians, clever as they were, figured this out very early on. Around 5,000 years ago, when most of the world was still figuring out basic farming, Egyptian craftsmen were already bending and shaping bundles of papyrus reeds into boats. These weren't just simple rafts either. These early vessels carried the weight of an empire. Imagine golden treasures glinting in the sunlight as they sailed north from Nubia. Picture massive granite statues, the kind that would take hundreds of men to move on land, floating gracefully down the river like they weighed nothing at all. Grain that would feed entire cities, soldiers heading to distant battles, officials traveling on important missions. All of this happened on the water. The papyrus boats were just the beginning, though. As Egypt grew richer and more ambitious, its shipbuilders started looking beyond the reeds growing along their riverbanks. They discovered something remarkable. Cedar wood from the mountains of Lebanon. This wood was different, stronger, more durable than anything they had at home. So Egyptian merchants sailed across the Mediterranean, trading their gold and grain for these precious logs. With this new material, Egyptian ships transformed from simple rivercraft into something much more impressive. These cedarwood vessels could handle rougher waters, carry heavier loads, travel longer distances. They opened up a whole new world of possibilities for the pharaohs and their people. Now, Here's where the story gets really interesting. The pharaohs weren't content to just sail up and down their own river. They had bigger dreams, grander ambitions. They started sending expeditions into places that seemed almost mythical. There was this land called Punt, somewhere along the Red Sea coast, a place so exotic and mysterious that it might as well have been another world. Egyptian sailors would load up their ships and head east across the Red Sea, navigating by stars and currents, searching for this legendary land. And when they found it, oh, what treasures they discovered. Incense that filled temples with heavenly scents, ivory white as moonlight, strange and wonderful animals that no Egyptian had ever seen before. These expeditions were like something out of a fairy tale, bringing back wonders that amazed even the most powerful pharaohs. But Egypt's relationship with water wasn't all about peaceful trade and exploration. No. The pharaohs learned early that whoever controls the water controls everything. Their ships became weapons, their sailors became warriors, their peaceful rivers and seas became battlegrounds. During what historians call the New Kingdom period, roughly between 1550 and 1070 BCE, Egypt faced some of its greatest challenges. There were these groups, mysterious people that historians simply call the Sea Peoples, who came from somewhere in the Mediterranean, like a storm made of ships and swords. Nobody's entirely sure where they came from, maybe from the Greek islands, maybe from the coast of what we now call Turkey. What we do know is that they were dangerous, organized, and they had their eyes set on the rich lands of Egypt. The pharaohs of this time, rulers with names like Thutmose III and Ramesses III, weren't about to let these invaders walk, or rather sail, into their kingdom unopposed. They built fleets of warships, vessels designed not for carrying grain or gold, but for carrying soldiers and weapons into battle. These weren't the sleek, fast ships that the Greeks would later perfect. Egyptian warships were different, broader, and more stable, built for a different kind of fighting. They had raised platforms where archers could stand and rain arrows down on their enemies. They carried marines, soldiers trained specifically for the brutal, cramped combat that happened when ships crashed together on the waves. Picture one of these sea battles if you can. The sun beating down on wooden decks, slick with spray and sweat. Egyptian archers, their bows drawn tight, sending volleys of arrows across the water while enemy ships tried to ram their vessels. When the ships got close enough, it became a different kind of fight entirely. Spearmen jumping from deck to deck, the clash of bronze weapons, the shouts of men fighting for their lives on narrow wooden platforms, surrounded by deep, dark water. The Egyptians were good at this kind of warfare. They had to be. Their empire depended on keeping their trade routes safe, their rivers clear, their coasts protected. Egyptian naval power wasn't just about winning battles, though. It was about something much more fundamental, the ability to keep their civilization running smoothly. You see, Egypt was never just one place. It stretched from the Mediterranean coast in the north all the way south into what we now call Sudan. The only thing holding this vast territory together was the Nile River and the ships that sailed on it. Without boats, Egypt would have been just a collection of isolated towns scattered across the desert. With them, it became one of the most powerful and long-lasting empires in human history. The economic side of this story is just as fascinating as the military side. Egyptian ships didn't just carry Egyptian goods, they became the delivery service for the entire Eastern Mediterranean. Grain from Egyptian fields fed people in distant cities. Egyptian ports became bustling centers where merchants from a dozen different cultures came to trade. Cities like Byblos became wealthy and important, specifically because they were stops along Egyptian trade routes. Other rulers, even those who might have been rivals to Egypt, recognized the skill of Egyptian shipbuilders. They would actually hire Egyptian craftsmen to build vessels for their own fleets. It was a bit like how today, certain countries are famous for making the best cars or electronics. Back then, if you wanted a really good ship, you wanted one built the Egyptian way. But here's the thing about power, especially the kind that depends on technology and skill. It doesn't last forever. Over the centuries, Egypt faced wave after wave of invaders and conquerors. Libyans from the west, Assyrians from the east, Persians from even further away. Each conquest brought new ideas, new ways of doing things, but it also gradually weakened Egypt's unique maritime traditions. Eventually, the Greeks arrived, bringing their own naval expertise, their own ship designs, their own ideas about how to fight at sea. Later came the Romans, with their massive fleets and their engineering genius. Egypt's naval power, which had dominated the eastern Mediterranean for over 1,000 years, slowly faded into history. Yet something remained, a foundation, a tradition, a way of thinking about water and ships, and the connection between naval power and prosperity. The knowledge that Egyptian shipbuilders had accumulated over millennia didn't just disappear. It influenced the maritime traditions of everyone who came after, from the Greeks to the Romans to the Arab sailors, who would later rediscover many of Egypt's old trade routes. When you think about it, there's something almost poetic about Egypt's naval story. Here was a civilization that rose from the desert, but found its true strength on the water. The Nile River, flowing north through endless sand, became the backbone of an empire. The Mediterranean Sea, vast and dangerous, became Egypt's highway to the world. Ships that started as simple bundles of reeds became sophisticated vessels capable of crossing oceans and winning battles. Egypt's ships may never have ruled the open seas the way later Greek and Roman fleets would. But in their own way, they ruled something perhaps more important. They ruled the rhythm of daily life, the flow of trade, the connection between distant parts of a vast empire. They turned a river into a highway, a sea into a bridge, and a collection of desert towns into one of history's greatest civilizations. Picture a world where the sea decides the fate of empires, where wooden ships carry the weight of civilizations on their creaking hulls. In the ancient Mediterranean, naval power wasn't just about having boats. It was about controlling the very lifelines of trade, communication, and survival itself. Rome started as a landlubber's dream, a city built on 7 hills where soldiers marched in perfect formation down stone roads that seemed to stretch forever. The Romans were masters of the earth beneath their feet, but the vast blue expanse of the Mediterranean might as well have been another planet. Their strength came from discipline, from the sound of thousands of sandaled feet hitting the ground in unison, from engineering marvels that carved straight lines through mountains and valleys. But then came Carthage, floating on the waves like a merchant prince's fever dream. For centuries, the Carthaginians had made the sea their highway, their ships cutting through Mediterranean waters with the confidence of generations. They knew every current, every wind pattern, every hidden harbor from Spain to North Africa. When these two powers finally locked horns in what history would call the Punic Wars, it became clear that Rome's road-building expertise wouldn't be enough. The year was 264 before the Common Era, and Rome found itself staring at a problem it had never really faced before. How do you fight an enemy that lives on the water when you barely know how to build a proper boat? The Romans had almost nothing that could be called a fleet. Just a handful of vessels that probably looked more like floating logs compared to Carthage's sleek warships. But here's where the Roman character really shines through. That stubborn refusal to admit defeat that would define their empire for centuries. Legend tells us they captured a single Carthaginian ship, a quinquereme with 5 banks of oars, and they studied it like scholars examining a sacred text. They took it apart, measured every plank, every rope, every bronze fitting, then set about the impossible task of building a navy from scratch. What happened next sounds almost too incredible to believe. Within months, Roman shipyards were churning out vessels by the hundreds. It was mass production, on a scale that wouldn't be seen again until the industrial age, driven by the kind of state-level organization that Rome did better than anyone. Imagine the sound of thousands of hammers, the smell of pine tar and sawdust, the controlled chaos of a civilization learning to master an entirely new element. But the Romans were practical people, and they knew something important about themselves. They weren't going to outsail the Carthaginians. Not in a generation, maybe not in several generations. So they did what Romans always did when faced with an impossible situation. They changed the rules entirely. Enter one of history's most ingenious military innovations, a device called the Corvus, which literally means raven in Latin. Picture a wooden bridge, about 36 feet long, fitted with a wicked metal spike on the end. This contraption could pivot and swing down onto an enemy ship, the spike biting deep into the enemy deck, locking the two vessels together like wrestlers in a deadly embrace. Suddenly, naval combat wasn't about seamanship anymore, it was about something Romans understood in their bones: close quarters fighting. When that bridge slammed down, Roman marines would pour across it like a human flood, turning what should have been a sea battle into the kind of infantry brawl, where Roman training and discipline gave them every advantage. The results were nothing short of spectacular. At places with names like Mylae and Cape Ecnomus, Roman crews who barely knew port from starboard were defeating Carthaginian sailors whose families had been working these waters since before Rome was founded. It was aggression and innovation triumphing over experience, the kind of upset that makes history fascinating. The Corvus wasn't perfect, though. Those heavy wooden bridges made Roman ships dangerously top-heavy, prone to capsizing in rough weather. Eventually, they abandoned the device, but by then it had already done its job. The tide of war had shifted, and Rome had learned something crucial about itself: that even the sea could be conquered if you were stubborn enough and clever enough to figure out how. By the time the Second Great War with Carthage rolled around, Rome's relationship with the water had completely transformed. Roman fleets now patrolled the western Mediterranean like guards walking their beats, protecting the supply lines that stretched like arteries to Spain and Africa. When Hannibal was rampaging through Italy, it was Roman naval power that prevented Carthage from sending him reinforcements, slowly strangling his campaign through strategic isolation. Naval blockades became as routine as siege warfare, amphibious landings as common as cavalry charges. The Romans had learned to use the sea as a weapon, turning harbors into prisons and coastlines into battlefields. It was a complete transformation of military thinking, the kind of adaptation that separates great civilizations from footnotes in history books. Under the empire that followed the Republic, Roman control of the seas expanded even further. The classis Missinensis and classis Ravenatis, two of the main imperial fleets, became the backbone of Mediterranean security. These weren't just warships. They were the guardians of an economic miracle, protecting merchant vessels loaded with grain from Egypt, silk from the east, and all the countless goods that kept the empire's cities fed and its people content. Piracy, which had once been a constant threat to Mediterranean commerce, became almost unthinkable under Roman naval dominance. Trade routes that had been dangerous gambles became reliable highways of prosperity. The ships carried more than cargo, they carried ideas, technologies, and cultures, weaving the diverse peoples of the Mediterranean into something approaching a single civilization. What makes Rome's naval transformation so remarkable is that they never really developed a maritime identity the way Athens or Carthage did. The Romans never saw themselves as natural-born sailors or children of the sea. To them, naval power was simply another tool, like a sword or a siege engine, something to be mastered when circumstances demanded it. Yet, by the 1st century of the Common Era, Romans were calling the Mediterranean Mare Nostrum, our sea, and it wasn't empty boasting. From the Strait of Gibraltar to the coast of Syria, from the shores of North Africa to the ports of Gaul, Roman ships moved with the confidence of absolute authority. They had taken a body of water that once represented their greatest vulnerability and turned it into the foundation of their security. The story of Rome's naval rise reminds us that adaptability might be the most important quality a civilization can possess. Rome wasn't destined to rule the waves, they simply refused to let the waves prevent them from ruling everything else. Through sheer determination, innovative thinking, and that peculiarly Roman talent for organization, they transformed their relationship with the sea, from fear to mastery. It's a reminder that geography isn't destiny, that the natural advantages we're born with matter less than what we choose to do with the challenges we face. Rome may have been born on land, among the hills and valleys of central Italy, but its greatest victories were won on water, proof that sometimes the most unlikely transformations produce the most lasting legacies. Picture the ancient Mediterranean, a vast blue highway connecting distant worlds. The empires that understood this watery realm would reshape civilization itself, not just through conquest, but through something far more profound. When we think of great powers from antiquity, we often imagine marching legions or towering walls, but the real architects of change moved across waves, carrying more than just soldiers and supplies. They carried the very DNA of human progress. Athens discovered this secret early. Their sleek warships didn't just protect the city, they transformed it into something unprecedented. A democracy funded by tribute from island allies, a cultural magnet that drew philosophers, artists, and thinkers from across the known world. The Athenian navy wasn't just a military force, it was an economic engine, pumping wealth through maritime trade routes that stretched from the Black Sea to southern Italy. Meanwhile, on the North African coast, Carthage was writing its own chapter in naval mastery. These descendants of Phoenician traders understood something fundamental about power, that whoever controlled the sea lanes controlled commerce itself. Their ships carried purple dye from distant shores, silver from Spanish mines, and exotic goods that would grace the tables of the wealthy across 3 continents. But perhaps no story illustrates naval power's true impact better than Rome's transformation. For centuries, Romans were farmers and foot soldiers, content to fight their neighbors on dry land. Then came their collision with Carthage, and suddenly, Rome realized it needed to become a sea power or perish. Within decades, these landlubbers had built fleets that would dominate every major body of water from Britain to Egypt. The psychological shift was remarkable. Roman engineers, who had mastered roads and aqueducts, now turned their genius to floating fortresses. They standardized ship designs, created massive harbor complexes, and developed logistics systems that could supply armies thousands of miles from home. The Mediterranean became, quite literally, a Roman lake. Yet the influence of ancient naval power extended far beyond military conquest. Consider the Greek colonists who sailed westward, establishing settlements that would become Naples, Marseilles, and countless other cities. These weren't just trading posts, they were cultural beacons, spreading Greek art, philosophy, and religious practices to peoples who had never heard of Homer or Plato. Egyptian vessels carried more than grain and gold. They transported papyrus scrolls containing mathematical knowledge, medical texts, and astronomical observations. When these ships docked in foreign ports, they were delivering the building blocks of human knowledge, piece by precious piece. The Phoenicians, perhaps history's greatest mariners, performed an even more fundamental service. Their alphabet, refined through centuries of commercial record-keeping, traveled with their ships to every corner of the Mediterranean. Greek letters, Latin script, and ultimately our own written language, all trace their ancestry back to Phoenician merchants who needed a simple way to record their transactions. Ancient shipbuilders pushed the boundaries of what seemed possible. The trireme, with its bronze ram and 3 banks of oars, represented the cutting edge of military engineering. But even more impressive were the massive grain ships that fed growing cities, some larger than anything built until the modern era. These vessels required innovations in carpentry, metallurgy, and navigation that would influence shipbuilding for millennia. Harbor cities became melting pots of human creativity. Alexandria, with its famous lighthouse and library, drew scholars from across the known world. Rhodes, strategically positioned between major trade routes, became wealthy enough to build one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. These weren't just ports, they were laboratories of human interaction, where different cultures mixed and created something entirely new. The economic ripple effects were staggering. Stable sea routes meant that a Roman housewife could season her dinner with pepper from India, while a Celtic chieftain in Britain might drink wine from Greece. Chinese silk reached Mediterranean markets, African ivory adorned European temples, and Spanish silver funded construction projects from Turkey to Tunisia. But naval warfare also introduced psychological elements that would echo through military thinking for centuries. The sight of enemy ships on the horizon created a unique form of dread, the knowledge that danger could approach from the vast emptiness of the sea. Fire ships, loaded with combustibles and steered toward enemy fleets, represented an early form of psychological warfare, designed as much to terrify as to destroy. The ramming tactics perfected by ancient naval commanders required split-second timing and nerves of steel. Unlike land battles, where formations could be adjusted and retreats organized, naval combat was often decided in moments. A single successful ram could send hundreds of men to the bottom of the sea, making naval warfare intensely personal, despite its grand scale. Perhaps most importantly, successful naval powers learned to think differently about geography itself. The sea wasn't an obstacle to overcome, but a medium to exploit. Distance became measured, not in miles, but in sailing days. Weather patterns, tides, and seasonal winds became as important as any intelligence about enemy movements. This maritime mindset created a different kind of empire, one held together not by roads and walls, but by shared waters and common interests. The Athenian Empire existed primarily in the minds of its subjects, bound together by the knowledge that Athenian ships could appear at any rebellious harbor within days. When we consider the legacy of ancient naval warfare, we're really examining how human beings learned to project power across empty spaces, to think strategically about resources scattered across vast distances. The principles developed by ancient admirals, the importance of logistics, the value of intelligence networks, the need for technological innovation, still guide military thinking today. The great naval battles of antiquity may have ended over 2,000 years ago, but their influence continues to shape our world. Every time a modern navy patrols international waters, every time cargo ships carry goods across oceans, every time different cultures meet and blend in port cities around the world, we're witnessing echoes of those ancient maritime empires that first understood the sea's true power. Picture a baby born in the mountains of ancient Persia around 600 before the Common Era. The shepherds who raised him had no idea they were nurturing the future architect of tolerance, the man who would redefine what it meant to rule an empire. This child would grow up to become Cyrus the Great, but his story begins with dreams and betrayal. His grandfather, the Median king Astyages, had been tormented by visions in his sleep. Court interpreters whispered that his daughter's son would one day steal his throne. So when baby Cyrus was born, the terrified king ordered his servant Harpagus to kill the infant. But Harpagus couldn't bring himself to murder a helpless child. Instead, he handed the baby to a shepherd who raised Cyrus in the wilderness, far from palaces and politics. Among common herders, this future emperor learned something precious: how to understand people from all walks of life. Even as a boy tending sheep, Cyrus displayed an unusual gift for leadership. Other children naturally followed him, drawn to his charisma and confidence. Eventually, rumors of this remarkable shepherd boy reached the royal court. When the truth was discovered, Astyages spared Cyrus, perhaps feeling guilty about his earlier cruelty. But the king wasn't so merciful to Harpagus. In a grotesque act of revenge, he killed Harpagus' son and served him as dinner at court. This horrific punishment would come back to haunt the Median ruler, because Harpagus never forgot and never forgave. Years passed. The shepherd boy became a Persian prince, shaped by his unique upbringing among both humble herders and nobles. By the time he reached manhood, Cyrus possessed something rare in the ancient world: genuine empathy for people of every social class. Around 553 before the Common Era, revolution began. Harpagus, still burning with hatred for Astyages, secretly contacted Cyrus with a proposal. "Rise up against your grandfather," he whispered, "and I'll help you from within the Median ranks." It was an offer Cyrus couldn't refuse. What followed wasn't a quick victory, but 3 years of careful warfare. Cyrus fought his way through Median territory, winning allies not just through military skill, but through an unusual quality: mercy. He often spared defeated enemies, earning a reputation as a different kind of conqueror. When the final battle came in 550 before the Common Era, Astyages found himself abandoned by his own troops. The Median Empire collapsed overnight, that Cyrus didn't celebrate with the usual pillaging and destruction. Instead, he preserved Median customs, kept their administrative systems, and welcomed former enemies into his government. This wasn't weakness, it was genius. By respecting local traditions, Cyrus discovered the secret to holding a vast empire together. Fear might win battles, but trust could win civilizations. Fresh from his victory over the Medes, Cyrus turned his attention westward to Lydia, ruled by the famously wealthy king Croesus. Croesus was so rich that his name became synonymous with fortune itself. Confident in his wealth and military might, he consulted the oracle at Delphi before attacking Persia. The oracle gave him a fateful prophecy: if he crossed the river to fight Cyrus, he would destroy a great empire. Encouraged by these words, Croesus launched his invasion, only to discover too late that the empire he would destroy was his own. The two armies clashed near the Halys River in 547 before the Common Era. After an inconclusive battle, Croesus retreated to his capital at Sardis, planning to wait for spring reinforcements. But Cyrus did something unexpected. He pursued his enemy through winter, something ancient armies rarely attempted. During the siege of Sardis, Cyrus reportedly used a clever tactical surprise. He deployed camels against the Lydian cavalry, knowing that horses were terrified of these strange, smelly creatures. The tactic worked brilliantly, neutralizing Croesus's strongest military asset. When Sardis fell and Croesus was captured, the world expected the usual execution. Instead, Cyrus spared his defeated enemy's life. Legend says that as Croesus was about to be burned alive, he cried out the name of Solon, the Greek philosopher who had warned him never to count a man fortunate until knowing how his story ended. Moved by this wisdom, Cyrus supposedly ordered the fire extinguished and made Croesus his advisor. Whether true or not, this story captured something real about Cyrus, his unusual capacity for clemency in an age of cruelty. By the late 540s, before the Common Era, only one major power stood between Cyrus and dominance of the known world, Babylon. This ancient metropolis, with its towering ziggurats and legendary hanging gardens, seemed impregnable behind massive double walls. But appearances deceived. Babylon's ruler, Nabonidus, had made himself deeply unpopular through religious reforms that offended the powerful priesthood. He had spent years away from his capital, leaving governance to his son Belshazzar, a name familiar from biblical stories. Cyrus sensed opportunity in this discontent. When he launched his campaign in 539, before the Common Era, he came not just as a conqueror, but as a liberator. His propaganda promised to free the Babylonians from misrule and restore proper religious practices. The strategy worked spectacularly. When Cyrus's army reached Babylon, the city gates opened without a fight. Whether through negotiation or betrayal, the greatest city in the world welcomed the Persian king as a savior. What happened next was revolutionary. Instead of sacking Babylon, Cyrus participated in its religious ceremonies and declared himself chosen by Marduk, the city's chief god, to restore justice and peace. He recorded these promises on a clay cylinder, written in cuneiform script. This document, now called the Cyrus Cylinder, reads like an ancient bill of rights. It promises to respect temples, repatriate displaced peoples, and govern with benevolence rather than oppression. Among those affected were the Jewish exiles, carried off to Babylon decades earlier by Nebuchadnezzar. Cyrus issued a decree allowing these Jews to return to Jerusalem and rebuild their destroyed temple. This act was so significant that the Hebrew Bible calls him God's anointed, a title usually reserved for Israelite kings. He remains the only non-Jewish ruler honored with this designation. The Cyrus Cylinder speaks in language that seems almost modern, emphasizing freedom, restoration, and legitimacy through justice. Instead of boasting about conquest and destruction, it highlights the ruler's role as protector of diverse cultures and faiths. This wasn't mere propaganda, it was practical politics. By respecting local customs and religions, Cyrus avoided the rebellions that typically plagued ancient empires. His subjects weren't just conquered peoples, they were partners in a vast multicultural experiment. Governing such diversity required extraordinary skill. Cyrus ruled over Persians, Medes, Babylonians, Lydians, Jews, and countless other groups, each with their own languages, gods, and traditions. What made him truly great wasn't the size of his conquests, but how skillfully he managed what lay within his borders. His solution was elegant in its simplicity, structured tolerance. Rather than crushing local cultures, he embraced a decentralized model that allowed regional differences to flourish under Persian oversight. Local leaders remained in place, local religions continued, and local customs were preserved. He adapted existing administrative systems, blending Median and Babylonian practices with Persian innovations. Power was delegated to governors called satraps, who oversaw taxation, security, and justice in their regions. These officials were often chosen from local elites, but remained accountable to central authority. Cyrus also invested heavily in infrastructure, improving trade routes, protecting caravans, and ensuring fair treatment for merchants. He understood that commerce was as vital to stability as armies, creating not just a military machine, but an economic and cultural network stretching from the Indus Valley to the Aegean Sea. Symbolism mattered too. In each conquered city, Cyrus made gestures of respect, restoring temples, participating in ceremonies, and preserving local institutions. These weren't empty theatrical performances, but diplomatic strategies that transform enemies into loyal subjects. The results spoke for themselves. Cyrus's rule provoked remarkably little resistance. Rather than inspiring fear and hatred, he often earned admiration. Even the Greeks, typically disdainful of foreign rulers they called barbarians, viewed him as wise and just. By 530 before the Common Era, Cyrus controlled the largest empire the world had ever seen. But like many great conquerors, his ambitions pushed him toward one final campaign. This time, he turned northeast toward the steppes, seeking to confront the Massageta, a confederation of nomadic tribes. These fierce warriors were led by Queen Tomiris, remembered as both a military genius and a symbol of defiance against imperial expansion. When Cyrus first attempted diplomacy, proposing marriage to the queen, she recognized it as a transparent political ploy and refused. Frustrated, Cyrus resorted to trickery. He left behind a feast of wine and rich food, knowing the nomads were unaccustomed to alcohol. After many of her warriors became drunk and vulnerable, they were ambushed and slaughtered, including Tomiris's own son. Devastated and enraged, the queen swore terrible vengeance. In the climactic battle that followed, her forces overwhelmed the Persians. Cyrus himself was killed in combat, far from the great cities he had conquered, with such wisdom and restraint. According to the Greek historian Herodotus, Tomiris had Cyrus's body decapitated and placed his severed head in a skin filled with blood, declaring, "Drink your fill of blood, you who thirsted for it." Whether this gruesome detail is fact or legend, we know that the great king died in this distant campaign. His body was eventually returned to Pasargadae, the capital he had founded in Persia, and buried in a modest yet dignified tomb that still stands today. The simple limestone structure reflected his character, impressive but not ostentatious, enduring but not boastful. The empire passed to his son Cambyses, who would continue the expansion into Egypt. But Cyrus's unique blend of tolerance, strategy, and visionary leadership could never be fully replicated. He had shown the world something unprecedented, that an empire could be built on respect rather than fear. His legacy extended far beyond political boundaries. The administrative systems he created, particularly the satrap system of provincial governance, became the foundation of imperial rule for centuries. His policies of religious and cultural freedom continued under his successors, making rebellion rare because Persian rule often proved less oppressive than what came before. Perhaps most importantly, Cyrus established the idea that kingship carried moral responsibilities. He wasn't merely king of Persia, but took grander titles, like king of the four corners of the world. Unlike the boastful tyrants of earlier ages, his legitimacy rested on the well-being of his subjects, not just military conquest. Even enemies paid him homage. Centuries later, Alexander the Great visited Cyrus's tomb and reportedly ordered its restoration after it had been damaged. Persian dynasties that followed continue to invoke his legacy to legitimize their own rule. In the Hebrew Bible, he appears not as a pagan oppressor, but as a divinely appointed liberator. The book of Isaiah calls him the Lord's anointed, honoring him as a righteous Gentile who used power to restore rather than destroy faith and freedom. Greek writers, despite centuries of Persian wars, often portrayed Cyrus as the ideal monarch. The Athenian Xenophon wrote the Cyropaedia, presenting him as the perfect ruler, wise, just, moderate, and brave. Though partly fictional, this work shaped ideas about leadership and ethics for generations. Islamic traditions sometimes identify Cyrus with Dhul Qarnayn, the two-horned one mentioned in the Quran as a righteous king who built barriers against chaos and injustice. While scholars debate this identification, it reflects the respect he commands across religious traditions. Modern leaders have also drawn inspiration from his example. Thomas Jefferson reportedly kept a copy of the Cyropaedia beside his bed. Iran's last Shah invoked Cyrus as a symbol of national unity and enlightened reform. Today, a replica of the Cyrus cylinder is displayed at the United Nations headquarters, honored as an early blueprint for human rights and tolerant governance. His appeal transcends any single culture or era because he represents something rare in history: power, exercised with wisdom and compassion. More than 2 millennia after his death, Cyrus the Great remains a fascinating paradox. A conqueror celebrated for his mercy, a foreign king praised by those he defeated. He showed that empires need not crush diversity to maintain unity, and that rulers could win lasting loyalty through respect, rather than terror. In an age when might typically made right, he chose a different path, proving that true greatness lies not in the extent of one's conquests, but in the wisdom with which one governs. His tomb may be simple stone, but his example built something far more enduring: the idea that justice and tolerance are not signs of weakness, but the strongest foundations upon which any lasting empire can stand. Picture, if you will, the banks of the Great Nile River, where the sun blazed mercilessly overhead. There, something curious was happening. People were deliberately removing all their hair, creating these perfectly smooth, bold canvases. And then, almost like artists, they would place the most extraordinary creations upon their heads. These weren't simple hair coverings, no, these were masterpieces. Wigs that told stories, wigs that announced your place in the world, wigs that were so elaborate they bordered on the miraculous. The wealthy would commission pieces made from real human hair, sometimes imported horsehair, or delicately woven plant fibers. And here's where it gets fascinating. They would top these creations with perfumed wax cones. Imagine walking through the streets as these slowly melted in the heat, releasing waves of luxury scents around you. The very air would announce your arrival before you even spoke. Women of noble birth wore theirs adorned with flowers, precious metals, colorful bands that caught the light. Each arrangement spoke of femininity, fertility, divine favor. Priestesses wore theirs in perfect symmetrical rows, echoing the order of the heavens themselves. For men serving the pharaoh, thick stylized wigs weren't just about wealth, they were about proximity to the gods, about being touched by divine authority. Children had their own language of hair. Most wore what they called the sidelock of youth. Picture a completely shaved head, except for one ornate braid dangling down. When childhood ended, when religious ceremonies marked their passage into adulthood, that single braid would be ceremonially cut away. And then there were the priests. In stark contrast to all this elaborate decoration, they shaved everything, every strand, from their heads to their entire bodies, in pursuit of perfect ritual purity. Though even they, during grand ceremonies, might don ceremonial wigs to represent their spiritual roles. But perhaps most touching of all, these wigs didn't end with life. Mummies were buried with their finest pieces in place, ensuring their status would continue into eternity. Hair, you see, wasn't vanity. It was identity itself, stretching beyond death. Now, let's journey north to the cold seas and fjords, where the Vikings lived their bold lives. If you imagine wild beards and intricate braids, you're actually quite right, but there was so much more intention behind those fierce looks than you might expect. In Norse society, hair was power. It was strength, honor, clan loyalty, even seduction. Both men and women treated their hair as seriously as they treated their weapons or their oaths. Warriors would walk into battle with their hair, elaborately braided, their beards thick and imposing. This wasn't just about keeping hair from their eyes during combat, though that was practical. It was about sending a message. Here was someone unafraid, someone ready to face death itself. Women wore their hair in complex patterns, weaving ribbons and beads through the strands. A married woman might cover hers partially, much like wedding rings signal commitment today. Archaeological sites reveal combs, hairpins, grooming tools buried alongside both men and women, suggesting this daily care was a source of genuine pride. But here's something remarkable. In Viking lore, cutting someone's hair without permission was considered such a grave insult, it could trigger blood feuds. Hair represented honor itself. To disgrace someone by chopping their locks was to attack their very soul. Even their gods reflected this. Thor, with his flaming red beard, Loki shape-shifting through different hair forms, and the goddess Sif, whose golden hair was so legendary that when Loki cut it as a prank, he had to beg dwarves to forge a replacement from actual gold. Hair wasn't just mortal identity, it was divine currency. The Romans, masters of order and control, naturally extended this to their hairstyles. In their world, every curl could declare allegiance, every trim could announce ambition. Early Roman men kept things simple. Short, neat, practical. Anything longer suggested foreign influence, laziness, even unmanliness. A clean shave and tidy cut weren't fashion choices. They were civic duties announcing discipline and service to the state. But as the empire grew more elaborate, so did the hair. Emperors like Nero let their curls flow in styles that mimicked Greek philosophers or divine statues. Some wore what we might call the Roman top knot, carefully sculpted to suggest intellect and refinement. These weren't accidents. They were propaganda, public images crafted with the precision of political campaigns. Roman women took this even further. The famous Flavian Tower style was literally architectural. Imagine a mountain of curls and braids, pinned and sculpted above the head, requiring slave labor, hot irons, hours of meticulous work. The more elaborate the creation, the clearer the message about wealth and leisure time. Empresses would debut new styles on statues and coins, which upper-class women across the empire would then copy. Wearing hair, like the empress, wasn't just flattery, it was political allegiance made visible. Meanwhile, enslaved people were often forced to keep their hair plain or short, denied this form of expression entirely. Soldiers wore practical cuts that reinforced unity over individual flair. But there were always rebels. Some Romans deliberately grew their hair long or adopted barbarian styles to show disdain for imperial values. Gladiators often wore dramatic styles to build their stage personas, part athlete, part celebrity, part threat to the established order. Far across the world, in ancient Japan, hair carried the weight of honor, duty, tradition. The samurai top knot, the distinctive style we still recognize today, wasn't just a haircut. It was a sacred contract, originally practical, keeping helmets comfortable and secure in battle. The style evolved into something far deeper during peacetime. The top knot became a rigid symbol of warrior status, of submission to Bushido, the way of the warrior. Cutting it off wasn't just changing your appearance, it was symbolic death. Disgraced samurai might be ordered to remove their top knots, or do it themselves as acknowledgement they were no longer worthy of their rank. In extreme cases, this cutting preceded seppuku, ritual suicide performed to atone for shame. Japanese women of the Heian period grew their hair to extraordinary lengths, sometimes longer than their entire bodies. This style, called Subrakshi, required immense care, time, wealth. It was elegance made manifest. Patience turned into beauty. Later periods brought increasingly ornate styles. The shimada, a coiled bun, adorned with pins, combs, decorations, each coded with meaning. Courtesans and geishas used elaborate hairstyles, not just to attract clients, but to signal their training stage, their experience level. Hair could also signal rebellion. Laws restricting hairstyles based on class were sometimes violated by artists, actors, masterless samurai, making bold statements about identity and resistance through nothing more than how they arranged their hair. Across ancient Africa, hair truly was a language. From intricate cornrows to towering coils, hairstyles served as identity cards, spiritual expressions, survival tools. In Nubia, Egypt's southern neighbor, communities developed braids and twists that communicated status, age, clan membership. Nubian queens wore complex braided wigs, rivaling Egyptian royalty, asserting their power in bold, unmistakable terms. Among the Himba people, red ochre paste made from powdered stone and fat is used to coat and sculpt braids. These styles don't just protect hair from desert climate. They signify everything from puberty to marriage, life shaped literally by the seasons. Perhaps most fascinating is how African hair encoded resistance during the slave trade. Cornrows weren't just practical. They were maps. Some patterns symbolized escape routes, safe meeting points. Others preserved ancestral styles, defying erasure with every twist and braid. In many West African cultures, shaved heads marked mourning or spiritual transitions, while thick locks could represent strength, divine connection, warrior status. Hair was sacred, never merely aesthetic. Ancient Greece, where marble statues still influence our ideas of beauty, treated hair as public performance. From tight curls of Athenian youths to flowing locks of philosophers, hair helped define who you were in the eyes of gods and citizens alike. Early Greek heroes like Achilles were described as having flowing, shining hair, symbolizing vitality and divine favor. But by the classical era, well-groomed, moderately short cuts became ideal for Athenian men, paired with beards that suggested wisdom and maturity. The combination conveyed intellect over impulse, logic over emotion. Slaves and foreigners were sometimes forced to shave their heads as marks of submission, making hair, ironically, a political privilege. Greek women wore their hair up and covered in public, braided into buns. Loose hair was reserved for specific rituals, mourning or ecstatic religious practices where unbound hair symbolized breaks from social order. Girls wore their hair down until puberty, when their first braid was often cut and dedicated to the goddesses Artemis as part of coming-of-age ceremonies. Even goddesses had signature styles. Athena's neat arrangement symbolized strategy and discipline. Aphrodite's flowing curls represented sensuality and divine beauty. In ancient China, hair was inseparable from moral philosophy, family duty, imperial control. Every strand served both aesthetic and symbolic purposes, guided by Confucian beliefs that your body, hair included, was a sacred gift from your parents. To cut or damage it unnecessarily showed disrespect. This belief permeated Chinese society for centuries. Even criminals faced hair shaving, not just as punishment, but as ritual humiliation and spiritual severance. Men wore long hair tied into top knots or buns, paired with robes and caps signaling wisdom and loyalty. To see a man with loose hair in public implied madness, mourning, or rebellion. Women's styles changed with age and status. Young girls wore twin buns or side ponytails, marking them as unmarried. Marriage brought formal arrangements, single coils pinned with combs, jade ornaments, gold sticks. Tang Dynasty court ladies created towering arrangements adorned with phoenix pins, flowers, silk. Dynastic shifts often forced appearance changes. The Manchu-led Qing dynasty enforced a hated style, front of head shaved with the rest braided into a long pigtail, a symbol of submission to foreign rule. Many chose death rather than accept. In ancient India, hair was sacred, intertwined with ritual purity, caste identity, spiritual symbolism. From twisted dreadlocks of sages to shaved heads of pilgrims, hair told complex stories of belief and transformation. Sadhus, wandering holy men, never cut their hair, letting it grow into thick, matted locks called jata. The longer and wilder, the more potent the message of transcendence from material concerns, emulating Lord Shiva, whose own locks held back the mighty Ganges River. Others chose shaved heads as ultimate sanctity. Pilgrims shaved before visiting sacred sites, offering hair as symbols of surrender and purification. Children's first haircuts cleansed bad karma from previous lives. Upper caste men kept single tufts at the crown after shaving the rest, marking them as twice-born, obligated to perform sacred rites. Women's styles communicated marital status, unmarried girls wearing loose hair or simple braids, married women binding theirs into disciplined buns and coils. Throughout all these ancient worlds, hair wasn't just about fitting in, it was also used to resist, rebel, defy. Changing or rejecting dominant hairstyles became acts of defiance, subtle or overt, against cultural norms and oppressive systems. Jewish people under Roman rule avoided elaborate grooming favored by elites, their beards and traditional styles quiet protests rooted in faith. Celtic Gauls lime washed their hair into wild, spiked crests that terrified Roman enemies while bonding tribes in resistance. Persian kings wore long curled hair and thick beards as statements of divine authority and cultural pride, their appearance declaring they were not Roman, would never be Roman. Even enslaved people, often forced to shave their heads to strip identity, used hair when possible to preserve lineage and memory. Braids concealed seeds, beads held meaning, styles recreated maps and myth. Women rebelled too. Spartan women wore short hair expressing independence and readiness for physical activity. Roman women rejected courtly trends to align with philosophical ideals. When emperors fell, cutting imperial-style hair became dangerous but bold statements of political allegiance. Across all these civilizations, when voices were silenced, the scalp became a canvas of resistance. A braid, a buzz, a curl could shout louder than words ever dared.